In the first days of August, 1503, one of the most powerful men in Europe rode out of Rome to have dinner at a vineyard. The villa belonged to Cardinal Adriano da Corneto, up in the hills where the air moved a little and the wine could be served cold. There were two guests of honor that evening. One was Pope Alexander VI, 72 years old, head of the Catholic Church. The other was his son, Cesare Borgia, 27, the most feared man in Italy. A week later, father and son were both in bed with fever. Rome did not wait for a diagnosis. Rome had its verdict by nightfall. Poison. The Borgias had carried poisoned wine up to that dinner, meaning to kill their host and seize his fortune. And somewhere between the kitchen and the table, the cups got switched. The family that had poisoned half of Italy, people said, had finally poisoned itself. For 11 years, this family had held the throne of St. Peter. They had appointed cardinals, married into 3 of Europe's ruling houses, and conquered a province with the sword. Europe believed they could not be beaten. Nobody, including the Borgias themselves, imagined that the whole structure could vanish in a single summer. We will come back to this dinner, and to what was really in that wine. The story of how one old man's fever erased an empire starts 50 years earlier, with a family that did not belong in Rome at all. In April of 1455, white smoke rose over the Vatican, and the crowd in the square below went quiet in the wrong way. A new pope had been chosen. The name came down from the window, and it was a name most Romans had never heard and could barely pronounce. Alonso de Borgia, a Spaniard from the kingdom of Valencia, on the far side of the Western Sea. In the palaces of the old Roman families that evening, men repeated the news to each other with a curl in the voice, and they settled on a word for the new pope and everyone who came with him. Catalans. It was not meant kindly. It meant foreigners. It meant help. It meant people who wash up here to serve us, not to rule us. The man under the crown was 76 years old, a church lawyer with gout, quiet habits, and no army of relatives clogging the halls. That was precisely why the cardinals picked him. The Conclave had deadlocked between Rome's 2 great rival clans, and neither side would let the other's man through. So they reached for a candidate who threatened nobody, an old foreign jurist who would wear the ring a year or 2. Often no one, and he took the name Calixtus III. The arrangement was cynical, and it was also a compromise everyone could live with, because everyone assumed it was temporary. What this man had actually won is worth a moment, because the Rome of 1455 was one of the strangest cities on earth. Perhaps 40,000 people lived there, camped inside walls built for 1 million. The population of the ancient capital had collapsed so completely that farmland ran through the middle of town. Sheep grazed among the broken columns of the Forum. Cattle were bought and sold in the ruins where senators once argued over the fate of the known world. The great aqueducts stood dry, so the city crowded down along its one working water source, the Tiber, a river that doubled as the sewer. Above the rooftops rose the fortress towers of the 2 families who actually ran the streets, the Orsini and the Colonna, clans so old and so armed that popes negotiated with them the way kings negotiate with kings. The Pope was the spiritual lord of all Christendom. Whole districts of his own city were not safe for him to ride through. A foreign pope with no soldiers and no Roman cousins had exactly one move available, and Calixtus made it. He sent for his family. They came up from Valencia, an entire migration of Borgias, and the old man began placing them the way a general places troops. One nephew took command of the Castel Sant'Angelo, the great round fortress guarding the Vatican, along with the payroll and the muscle that came with it. Another nephew, a law student of 25, with a quick smile and quicker eyes, was raised straight into the College of Cardinals. His name was Rodrigo. In Rome, the family name softened on Italian tongues from Borgia to Borgia, and the Roman aristocracy watched a boy from nowhere put on the red hat their own sons had waited generations for, and they began keeping a ledger of insults to be repaid. Calixtus himself barely noticed Rome at all. Constantinople had fallen to the Ottoman Turks 2 years before his election, and the old man burned his entire short reign trying to raise a crusade to win it back, selling off palace tapestries and silver plate to fund ships that history barely remembers. Let that stand for the man. He was not building a dynasty. He was an elderly believer, chasing a lost cause, and the family he pulled up behind him was less a plan than a reflex. The instinct of an outsider who trusted nobody in that city except his own blood. He was right not to trust it. In August of 1458, after 3 years on the throne, Calixtus III lay dying, and Rome did not wait for him to finish. Mobs came out with the news of his final illness, still fresh, and they went hunting. Catalan houses were looted down to the door hinges. Catalan officials ran for the gates in borrowed clothes. The nephew who commanded Sant'Angelo grabbed what treasure he could carry, fled the city by night, and was dead himself within weeks of fever, before he could enjoy a coin of it. Everything the family had gathered in 3 years. Offices, income, protection, evaporated in roughly the time it takes a sick old man to stop breathing. The lesson could not have been written in larger letters. In Rome, power borrowed from a patron dies with the patron. When the man behind you falls, the city takes back everything, and the city enjoys doing it. One member of the family did not run. Rodrigo Borgia, 27 years old, Cardinal for barely a year, stayed in Rome while his relatives scattered, and walked into the Conclave to help elect the next pope, the pope who would preside over the wreckage of his own family's fortunes. Picture him there among men who despised him, the nephew of the dead Catalan, politely casting his vote. He had just seen exactly what the city did to outsiders the moment their protector died. He chose to remain inside the machine that had crushed his uncle, and he spent the next 34 years learning it gear by gear, until he understood it better than the Romans did. On almost any morning in the Rome of the 1470s, you could find a line of important men waiting outside a palace that did not belong to the Pope. Ambassadors stood in that line, abbots stood in it, and bankers, and noblemen holding petitions, and lawyers holding other men's petitions. The man they were waiting for held an office most people outside the church have never heard of, and the office explains everything that happens in the rest of this story. He was the Vice-Chancellor of the Holy Roman Church, head of the Papal Chancery, and in practice, that meant one thing: paper. Every formal act of the Church became a document, and every document passed through the Chancery. A German prince needs permission to marry his cousin. That permission is a document. A French bishop dies, and someone must be named to the seat, which is worth a fortune in yearly income. The naming is a document. A monastery wants a privilege. A city wants a dispensation. A king wants a questionable heir, declared legitimate. Documents, documents, documents. And each one carried a fee, and the fees flowed through the office of the vice-chancellor, the way the Tiber flowed through Rome. The man running that office touched the paperwork of all Christendom. He learned what every crown in Europe wanted, what it feared, and precisely what it would pay. Rodrigo Borgia was named to the office in 1457, at about 26, by his uncle. The appointment was pure family favoritism, and nobody expected it to outlast the old man. Rodrigo then held that office for 35 years, under 4 successive popes, which is the single most remarkable fact about him, and the one his enemies could never explain away. Consider what those transitions meant. Each time a pope died, Rome flipped. The dead man's favorites were pushed out, their offices handed to the new winner's friends. Their debts suddenly called in. A papal election was a regime change, and regime changes have casualties. Rodrigo, the ultimate creature of favoritism, the Catalan upstart who should have been the first casualty of 1458, survived every single one. Pope after pope looked at the foreigner running the chancery and decided he was too useful to remove. He knew where the money came from. He knew how the paper moved. He made every new administration run smoother than it would have run without him. And he made sure every new pope understood that. Ability kept him in the room. The office made him rich. How rich? A contemporary who toured his palace wrote about it the way people write about things they cannot quite believe. Walls hung with tapestries woven in gold, chests of coined silver, gems, plate, carpets from the East. A household that outshone kings. By the 1480s, Rodrigo Borgia was widely reckoned the second wealthiest man in the College of Cardinals. And the wealth was almost beside the point. The real fortune was information. For 3.5 decades, the secrets of every royal marriage, every disputed inheritance, every bishop's debt in Europe crossed one desk. And the man behind the desk forgot nothing. He was, by every surviving account, enormously charming. And the charm was a working tool. Contemporaries describe a big, vigorous, handsome man with a famous laugh. A man who spoke and beautiful women stopped to listen. A man who could disagree with you so pleasantly that you left convinced he had done you a favor. Rome forgives a great deal in a man who is both rich and good company at dinner. And Rodrigo tested the limits of that forgiveness early. In the summer of 1460, when he was still in his 20s, he attended a private garden party in the town of Siena, and word of what went on there travelled fast enough and far enough to reach Pope Pius II. The Pope sent his young cardinal a letter of rebuke, and the letter survives. It scolds Rodrigo for an afternoon of dancing and games in a closed garden with the ladies of the town, from which the Pope noted acidly, the husbands and fathers had been excluded. Read as evidence. The letter proves less than the legend wants it to prove. An afternoon of flirtation is not an orgy. And Pius, who had written racy fiction in his own youth, scolded like a man managing a talented junior rather than casting out a monster. The letter matters for a different reason. It is the first document in a pattern that runs unbroken through this entire story. The scandal is real. The scandal is written down by the highest authority in the church. And the scandal costs Rodrigo Borgia absolutely nothing. He apologized gracefully, kept his offices, kept his habits, and kept rising. 30 years before it mattered most. He was learning exactly how much Rome would tolerate from a man it found useful. And the answer was nearly everything. There was one more fixture in his life, and she enters the story quietly. On the far side of the river from the Vatican, her name was Vannozza Catane. She was Roman, beautiful by report, and nobody's fool. Across the years of their long attachment, she ran respectable businesses in the city, inns and property, a woman with her own accounts and her own standing. What she and Rodrigo had was not one of those passing arrangements that powerful clergymen made and unmade in a season. It lasted decades. Through her formal marriages of convenience, through his rise, something steady and almost domestic, a marriage in everything except the one thing a cardinal could never give it, the name, and in a house across the Tiber, out of sight of the chancery and its line of waiting ambassadors, that almost marriage began producing children. By the end of the 1480s, Rodrigo Borgia had spent more than 30 years inside the machinery of the church and had reached a strange kind of summit. He was not the Pope. He had watched 4 other men become Pope. He was the constant, the one who remained while the throne changed hands above him. And by now he knew the price of every man in Rome, because at one time or another he had signed the invoices. For most of them, he was also past 60 and running out of patience. The next time the throne came open, the man who processed everyone else's ambitions intended, at last, to file his own. Across the river from the Vatican, a short walk over the bridge by the Castel Sant'Angelo, stood a comfortable house where 4 children were growing up. And everyone in the neighborhood knew exactly whose children they were. Their father wore the red robes of a cardinal. That, by itself, surprised nobody in the Rome of the 1480s. Clergymen of rank fathered children often enough that the church had developed a whole polite vocabulary for it. Such children were introduced as nieces and nephews. And the fiction was so common, and so commonly winked at, that it left a permanent mark on the English language. Our word nepotism comes from the Italian nipoti, meaning nephew, born out of centuries of churchmen promoting sons they could not name. Rome understood the game and played it smoothly. Rodrigo Borgia played it differently, and the difference tells you who he was. He did not hide these children in distant towns or park them with obscure relatives. He acknowledged them, provided for them, promoted them, and kept them close. As they grew, he moved them out of their mother's world and into his own orbit, placing them in the household of his cousin, Adriana de Mila, a Roman lady of his own blood, where they would be raised within reach of his hand and his plans. Vannozza kept her inns and her accounts and stayed a presence in her children's lives. But the children now belonged to the Cardinal's project, whatever that project turned out to be. In a city where great men called their sons nephews, Rodrigo Borgia called his sons. Rome noticed and filed it away. There had been older children from his earlier years, and one of them matters to this story, mostly by his absence. A son named Pedro Luis had been set up in Spain as the first Duke of Gandia, a real title with real land, bought and secured through the family's royal connections there. Pedro Luis died young, in 1488, and the Spanish duchy did not vanish with him. It sat waiting, an empty chair at the table, and it would pass to the next brother in line. Keep that empty chair in mind. The 4 children in Adriana's household were these: Cesare, the eldest of the group, born around 1475, Juan, a year or so behind him. Though the records blur, and historians still argue over which brother was actually older, which is somehow fitting for two boys whose whole lives would be a dispute over precedence. Then Lucrezia, born in 1480, the only girl, then Geoffrey, the baby, whom even his own father sometimes regarded with a shrug. Watch how the Cardinal deployed them, because every one of these children had an assignment before any of them could read. Cesare was the sharp one. Tutors noticed it. Visitors noticed it. Everyone who met the boy noticed it. He was quick, physically gifted, hungry for the front of every room, and his father aimed him at the church. Cesare was sent to study law at Perugia and then Pisa. Groomed for the ladder, Rodrigo himself had climbed, and the ladder was greased hard. The boy held church incomes while still a child. He was made a bishop in Spain at 15. There was a plain logic to it. Since the church was where the family's power actually lived, and the ablest son belonged where the power was. The logic had one flaw, and everyone could see it except the man making the assignments. Cesare wanted the other job. The other job belonged to Juan. Juan inherited the dead brother's Spanish duchy, and with it, the family's secular future, the swords, the titles, the royal marriage already being sketched. He was, by broad agreement among people who watched the family, the least equipped of the brothers for any of it. A preening, touchy boy with a talent for making enemies and his father's whole heart in his hands. That is the plain, strange fact underneath everything that follows. Rodrigo Borgia, the coldest appraiser of men in Rome, who priced ambassadors and kings at a glance, loved his least able son the most, and handed him the sword. The ablest son got the robes, and got to watch. Lucrezia was the treasure, and she was treated like one. In every sense that word carries. She was given the education of a small princess, Latin and French and Spanish, music, poetry, the training of a girl being polished for display in the highest markets of Europe. The market opened early. Before her 11th birthday, she had been formally promised in marriage twice, to two different Spanish noblemen, and both contracts were torn up when better prospects surfaced. Nobody asked Lucrezia anything, because the question was never about her. A daughter of this house was capital, and capital does not choose where it is invested. Geoffrey was the reserve, the extra piece kept in the box in case the board changed. The board would change. A father can love his children and use them. And the tragedy waiting inside this family is that Rodrigo Borgia genuinely did both, at full strength. At the same time, the affection is documented beyond doubt. Witnesses over the years describe him lighting up around his children, boasting of them, grieving for them with a violence that frightened his own household. The usage is documented just as thoroughly. In the betrothal contracts, and the bishoprics, and the assignments handed down like verdicts, he saw no contradiction, and by the standards of his world, there was none. Every great family in Italy deployed its children. He simply did it with better material, from a higher platform, and with less shame. By the early 1490s, the platform was as high as a cardinal's platform could go, and the man standing on it was past 60. His children were nearly grown. His plans for them were drawn. Everything now waited on a single event. The same event this family had been broken by once before, 34 years earlier, when a pope died and Rome took everything back. The next time a pope died, Rodrigo Borgia did not intend to be among the losers. On the 25th of July, 1492, Pope Innocent VIII stopped breathing, and the waiting ended. In the first week of August, 1492, masons walled up the windows of the Sistine Chapel. That was the procedure. 23 cardinals filed in. The doors were locked from the outside, and the windows were sealed with brick, leaving the electors of Christendom in candlelight and summer heat until they produced a pope. Wooden cells lined the chapel walls, one to a cardinal, each with a bed and a chamber pot and a candle. The men inside included princes of great families, servants of foreign kings, scholars, criminals, and several who were all four at once. The city outside settled in to enjoy itself. Romans bet on papal elections, the way they bet on horses, openly, with odds, and the bookmakers' money that August was not on Rodrigo Borgia. It is one of history's better coincidences that 3 days before those doors closed, on the 3rd of August, 3 small ships had slipped out of a harbour in southern Spain under a Genoese captain with strange ideas about the width of the ocean. Nobody in the Sistine Chapel had any reason to think about Christopher Columbus. Within a year, the men elected in that room would be redrawing the map of the entire world because of him. We will get there. The betting favoured 2 candidates. The first was Giuliano della Rovere, hard-faced, hot-tempered, a warrior in cardinal's robes, nephew of a former pope and patron of artists, backed for this election by a very large sum of French money, tens of thousands of ducats deposited with a Roman bank to be spent making him pope. Remember the name della Rovere. This story is not finished with him, and he is not finished with this family. The second favourite was Ascanio Sforza, brother of the man who ruled Milan, which meant he came with a duchy's treasury and a duchy's interests attached. Between these 2 blocks, French money against Milanese money, the conclave was expected to grind out its compromise. Rodrigo Borgia entered as the 3rd man, the outsider's outsider, a 61-year-old Spaniard whom the Italian factions had passed over in 2 previous conclaves. What he carried into the chapel could not be deposited with a bank. He carried 35 years of the chancery, the memory of every favour owed and every weakness filed, and a personal inventory of offices, palaces, abbeys, and towns that he alone controlled and could therefore promise. The French candidate could spend French money, and every cardinal taking it knew he was buying a French pope. Borgia's currency was his own, and it obligated nobody to any king. The early ballots went as expected, which is to say, nowhere. Della Rovere's block and Sforza's block cancelled each other. Scrutiny after scrutiny. While the August heat thickened inside the bricked-up chapel and the food sent in through the turning hatch got plainer, which was itself part of the procedure, an ancient trick to encourage decisiveness. Somewhere in those airless nights, Ascanio Sforza did the arithmetic and accepted that he could not be pope this time. The French money made him impossible. Milan's enemies were too many. The votes were not there, which left him holding a block of electors and a decision about where to spend them. And it left Rodrigo Borgia in the cell nearby, holding the answer, what passed between them and between Borgia and a dozen other men. In the small hours of the 10th and 11th of August is the exact point where the documents stop and the legend begins. So let us be careful and honest here. In a story that will need this honesty again. Here is what was said afterward. Rome told itself, and the story spread across Europe and has been repeated for 5 centuries, that 4 mules loaded with silver were seen in the night, moving from the Borgia palace to the palace of Ascanio Sforza, the price of the papacy delivered by pack animal before the decisive vote. It is a perfect story. It has a number. It has an image. You can see the mules in the dark street. It comes to us from hostile Roman diarists writing down what the city was saying. And the city was saying it, because the city had watched Ascanio Sforza change sides and wanted to know the price. Here is what can actually be established. Nobody reliable saw those mules. The tale is rumor, recorded as rumor, but the ledger that survives is in its own way more damning than the mules, because within days of the election, the paying out was public and official. Ascanio Sforza was named Vice-Chancellor of the Church, handed the very office that had made Borgia rich, the greatest administrative prize in Christendom, and along with it he received the Borgia Palace itself, the one with the gold-woven tapestries, as a personal residence. The Cardinal Orsini received fortified towns. The Cardinal Colonna received a rich abbey, benefice by benefice, castle by castle. The men who swung their votes to Borgia collected, in plain sight, through the ordinary machinery of appointment. No silver had to cross Rome in the dark. The payment travelled by paperwork. The medium, Rodrigo Borgia, had mastered for 35 years, and it would be pedantry to insist on the difference. He bought it. The only honest addition is that every serious candidate in that chapel was buying, with whatever he had, French gold or Milanese favours or family lands. Simony was not the scandal of 1492. Simony was the system of 1492. Borgia came to the auction with the deepest inventory and the fewest scruples about emptying it. And here is why the story of the mules and the whole black legend of that August survived and grew teeth. The loser lived. Giuliano della Rovere walked out of that conclave beaten, nursing a hatred of Rodrigo Borgia that would organize the rest of his life, and he lived another 21 years, long enough to outlast every Borgia in this story, long enough to become Pope himself, long enough to sit on the throne while the first histories of the Borgia years were written under his eye, by men who knew what their patron wanted to read. Once in power, he even explored the idea of formally declaring Borgia's election void for simony, and though the lawyers talked him out of it, the intent tells you everything. History is usually written by winners. The Borgia legend is that rarer thing. History written by the loser of an election, who got the last 20 years, and the pens. Before dawn on the 11th of August it was done. The votes crossed the threshold, and by the account, Rome repeated with relish. The new pope did not manage even a decent imitation of reluctance. Tradition called for a moment of humble hesitation, a murmured protest of unworthiness. Rodrigo Borgia, 61 years old, 35 years in the waiting room, is said to have announced his own election with both fists raised. I am Pope. I am Pope. The ballots were burned. The smoke went up, and the walled-up windows were broken open to announce him. One formality remained. A new pope sheds his birth name and chooses what he will be called, and the choice is the first message of every pontificate. Pious men reached for the names of saints and healers. This one announced that he would reign as Alexander VI, and to the people listening in the square, the name could hardly avoid summoning the other Alexander. the Macedonian who had conquered the known world before he was 33. The message landed where messages land, in Florence, in Naples, in the chancelleries of France and Spain. Men weighed the news of a Borgia papacy and wrote their assessments, and one Italian ambassador reached for the phrasing history has kept. Now we are in the power of a wolf. He wrote, perhaps the most rapacious this world has ever seen. The wolf, for his part, had waited half his life for that morning, and he did not see a wolf in the mirror. He saw a man of 61, with perhaps a decade left to him, holding at last the one office on earth that could not be inherited, could not be bequeathed, could not be passed to a son, an office that died with its holder and went back to the electors, the office his own uncle had held while Rome sharpened its knives and waited. He had seen, at 27, exactly what the death of a Borgia pope cost the Borgias. He now controlled every appointment, every dispensation, every crown and marriage and red hat in the Catholic world. The man who had spent 35 years processing other men's ambitions would never process another one that was not his own. And across the river, in the household of Adriana de Mila, 4 young people were waiting to learn what their father's new job meant for the assignments they had carried since birth. He was the Pope. He had roughly 10 years. The clock that started ticking in 1458 now began to tick very loudly indeed. In the winter after the election, if you had climbed the scaffolding inside a certain suite of rooms on the 2nd floor of the Vatican Palace, you would have found a painter from Umbria lying on his back with gold leaf under his fingernails. His name was Bernardino di Betto, though everyone called him Pinturicchio, the little painter, because he was small and slight and the nickname stuck. He was one of the finest decorators alive, and the new pope had hired him, at speed and at great expense, for a job with no precedent in scale. The rooms themselves were old. Earlier, popes had built and lived in that wing for 2 centuries. What Alexander commissioned was the conversion of 6 existing chambers into a single continuous statement, remodeled, connected, and decorated top to bottom according to one program. And the program was about a family. The work that came off those scaffolds still exists, and you can walk through it today, which is worth remembering as you hear what it contains. The ceilings blaze with gold. Saints and prophets fill the walls. The Annunciation, the Resurrection, Saint Catherine of Alexandria disputing with the pagan philosophers, all the proper furniture of Christian art, painted with a jeweller's care. Then you look closer, and the proper furniture starts to behave improperly, woven through the holy scenes, repeated on the ceilings, marching along the borders. Appears an animal that has no place in any Bible. A bull, a great red bull on a field of gold, horns lowered, again and again and again, dozens of times, hundreds if you count the small ones. It is the heraldic emblem of the house of Borgia, and in these rooms it grazes among the apostles as though it had always belonged there. Visitors to the Vatican museums still stand in those rooms and count bulls. The faces in the frescoes were not entirely invented either. Roman gossip, repeated by early writers and never quite killed by later scholars, held that Pinturicchio painted the family into the walls. The serene Saint Catherine, disputing before the emperor, with her golden hair loose down her back, was said to carry the face of the Pope's own daughter, Lucrezia, 13 years old, the year the painter set to work. In another room, the figure kneeling in adoration before the risen Christ, painted with unmistakable portrait-grade precision in his gorgeous cope of gold, is Alexander VI himself. There is no ambiguity about that one. The Pope had himself painted into the resurrection, 10 feet from his family's bulls. That was the stage set. Now watch the family walk onto it. Cesare came first. And Cesare came fast. Within weeks of the election, the 17-year-old was handed the Archbishopric of Valencia, the richest church office in Spain, the same seat his father had held since the days of Calixtus. He was not a priest. He would never become a priest. The detail obstructed nothing. The following year, at 18, his father raised him to the College of Cardinals, and the boy who wanted a sword put on the red hat of a prince of the church, with an income to match and a face. Observers noted that did not always trouble to look grateful. The list of new cardinals created that day is its own small portrait of the pontificate, because alongside Cesare, it included a pleasant young Roman nobleman named Alessandro Farnese, whose qualifications for the honor were the subject of open joking in the city. Alessandro had a sister. Her name was Julia Farnese. She was about 20. She was married to the son of that same Adriana de Mila, who had raised the Pope's children. And all of Rome knew, because Rome always knew, that she was the mistress of the 62-year-old Pope. The city's wits called her the Bride of Christ. Her brother's red hat was understood as family courtesy, and Romans, who have a genius for nicknames, called him the Petticoat Cardinal. Alessandro Farnese kept the hat, outlived everyone in this story, and died as Pope Paul III, which tells you something about how permanent the stains of scandal actually were in that world. Lucrezia moved closest of all. She was installed with Adriana and Julia in a brand new palace built practically against the walls of St. Peter's, a few minutes' walk from her father's painted rooms, and the arrangement in that household deserves plain description, because no novelist would dare invent it. Under one roof lived the Pope's teenage daughter, the Pope's young mistress, and the elderly cousin who chaperoned them both, while the mistress's husband, the chaperone's son, was kept conveniently elsewhere. Ambassadors wrote home about it in the tone men use when they are not sure they will be believed, and the parties moved in with them. Through the 1490s, the private apartments of the Vatican hosted family suppers, dancing, theatrical evenings, wedding feasts. The Pope loved spectacle, loved music, loved watching his children shine in company, and the painted rooms under the golden bulls filled with exactly the kind of life that the palaces of great secular princes contained everywhere in Italy. That is the point to hold on to. And it is why this chapter asks for astonishment rather than easy outrage. Almost nothing the Borgias did inside those walls was new in kind. Popes before Alexander had children, popes before Alexander had favorites, took money, enriched relatives. What no pope had done was this: move the family into the center of the stage, in daylight, without apology, and paint the family crest across the ceiling of the apostolic palace as though the house of Borgia and the house of St. Peter had merged. A detail from the household accounts makes the merger literal. When Lucrezia was married in the Vatican in June of 1493, in a ceremony we will come to properly, the guests dined and danced and watched comedies late into the night in the papal apartments, under the frescoes, among the bulls, and the Pope presided over all of it from the center of the room. Delighted, expansive, entirely at home. A Ferrarese observer recorded the scene with a kind of numb precision. He was describing a dynastic court. It happened to be the Vatican. The family had not merely entered the Vatican had begun to look like the family. In the first week of March, 1493, a battered little ship called the Nina came limping out of an Atlantic storm into the harbour of Lisbon. Of all possible harbours, the most awkward one, and her captain sent word ashore that he had returned from the Indies. The captain was Genoese. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he was, at that moment, the most important man in the world, and one of the few people in Lisbon who fully believed his own news. He had sailed west from Spain 7 months earlier with 3 ships under the flag of Ferdinand and Isabella. He had found land, islands, people, gold in promising quantities, and he had come back alive to say so. He was wrong about almost every detail that mattered, beginning with his unshakable conviction that the islands lay off the coast of Asia. He had in fact bumped into a hemisphere nobody in Europe had ever accounted for. The mistake changes nothing about what happened next, because what happened next was a property dispute, and property disputes do not wait for geography. The awkwardness of Lisbon was this: Portugal and Spain were the 2 exploring powers of the age, bitter maritime rivals, and Portugal held a stack of papal documents, decades old, granting her rights over new lands discovered along the road to the Indies. The King of Portugal listened to Columbus tell his story, did his own arithmetic, and concluded that whatever the Genoese had found belonged, by existing paperwork, to Portugal. Preparations for a Portuguese fleet began almost at once. Ferdinand and Isabella, receiving Columbus in triumph at Barcelona a few weeks later, understood immediately that their discovery was one legal challenge away from being taken from them, and that a war over invisible islands was genuinely possible. So they did what European crowns did with title disputes over pagan lands. They took it to the one court both sides acknowledged, the papacy, which by long tradition claimed authority to assign sovereignty over territories outside Christendom, and the judge who received the most consequential real estate case in human history was 3 months into his pontificate. A Spaniard from Valencia, a subject by birth of the crown of Aragon, which is to say, a subject by birth of King Ferdinand himself. The petitioners knew their judge. The judge knew his petitioners. Through the spring and summer of 1493, the papal chancery issued a series of bulls in favour of Spain, and the centrepiece is known by its opening words, Inter caetera. It granted to the crowns of Castile and Aragon all lands discovered and to be discovered toward the west and south, lands not already held by a Christian prince. And then it did the thing no document had ever done before. It drew a line, from pole to pole, down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 100 leagues west of the Azores and Cape Verde Islands, everything found beyond that line to the west. The bull assigned to Spain, the rights of Portugal held to the east. One sentence, one imaginary meridian, and a hemisphere that Europe had known about for roughly 10 weeks was divided like a farm between 2 heirs. Take a moment with the American thread here, because for once the phrase changed the map of the world is a job description rather than an exaggeration. The Portuguese, unhappy with the Pope's line, negotiated directly with Spain the following year at a town called Tordesillas and pushed the line farther west. And that adjustment is the reason the eastern shoulder of South America fell on Portugal's side of the meridian. It is why 200 million Brazilians speak Portuguese today, while their neighbors speak Spanish. The line went on echoing for centuries in the law of the Western Hemisphere. The wider European legal tradition, later associated with these bulls, the so-called doctrine of discovery, was cited by the Supreme Court of the United States in the 1820s in a ruling on Native American land title, a ruling American courts have wrestled with ever since. And the Vatican itself was still issuing formal statements repudiating that doctrine in the 2020s, 530 years after the ink dried. A copy of the 1493 bull sits today in the Library of Congress. The most notorious pope of the Renaissance signed a founding document in the paper trail of the Americas, and the signature has never entirely stopped mattering. Whether any of this weighed on Alexander VI as a matter of conscience, the record does not say. What the record does say, with beautiful clarity, is what else was moving between Rome and the Spanish court in exactly those months. The Pope needed Ferdinand and Isabella, not for the glory of Spain, and not for the souls of the Indies. He needed them because his son Juan held a Spanish duchy, and the duchy was only as secure as royal favor made it. Juan was Duke of Gandia, heir to his dead brother's title, and the plan, drawn years earlier and now ready to execute, was to marry him to Maria Enriquez, a cousin of King Ferdinand himself, a bride of royal blood who came with royal protection attached. The negotiations for that marriage and the drafting of the Atlantic bulls ran through the same offices in the same season, and the Spanish sovereigns, who had refused their kinswoman to the son of a mere cardinal, found no obstacle now that the father wore white. In August of 1493, while the ink of Inter Caetera was still fresh, 17-year-old Juan Borgia sailed for Spain with a fleet, a fortune in jewels, and written instructions from his father covering everything from managing his money to consummating his marriage. Instructions whose surviving text suggests the Pope knew his favorite son's character precisely and promoted him anyway. Nobody needed to write down a bargain, and no historian has ever found one, because none was required. This was simply how the machine ran. Favor flowing one direction, favor flowing back, the spiritual and the dynastic moving through the same pen. Kings petitioned, popes granted, families rose. One stroke of ink in Rome had cut the planet in half, and the man who made it never saw a league of the world. He divided and never expressed the slightest recorded curiosity about it. For him, 1493 was the year the family fortress went up, wall by wall. The Spanish wall was Juan's wedding, and it was standing. In Rome that same June, under Pinturicchio's fresh-painted bulls, he had already begun raising the Italian wall, out of the marriage of his 13-year-old daughter. On the 12th of June, 1493, a 13-year-old girl walked through the Vatican in a wedding gown that cost more than most Roman palaces, with her train carried behind her and 500 guests waiting under the painted ceilings of her father's new apartments. Lucrezia Borgia was getting married. The groom stood twice her age, a 26-year-old widower named Giovanni Sforza, lord of the small Adriatic town of Pesaro. And if you had asked anyone in that room what the bride and groom had in common, the honest answer would have been a single word: Milan. Giovanni was a cousin of the ruling Sforza of Milan, the family of Cardinal Ascanio, the man whose votes had made Alexander Pope 10 months earlier. The wedding was the receipt. The Pope presided over the festivities himself. Regent, enormous, entirely in his element. There was a banquet. There were comedies performed into the small hours. There was dancing, and the assembled ambassadors watched the Pope's daughter dance, and the Pope's mistress glitter, and the Pope's son, Cesare, 18 years old and newly wrapped in Cardinal's red, watching everything from the edge of the room. The Ferrarese envoy wrote it all down for his master, with the careful blankness of a man who knows his letter will be read aloud at another court. Late in the evening, by his account, sweets were tossed, and the party grew loud in ways he declined to describe. Rome supplied the missing details within the week, each retelling more lurid than the last. And that is worth noting for later, because it is the first full demonstration of a pattern. Whatever actually happened at a Borgia party, the version that travelled was the version their enemies preferred, and the family kept handing their enemies material by holding the parties in the Vatican. Set the gossip aside and look at the machinery, because 1493 and 94 were the years the machinery ran at full speed, and it was building something specific. Think about the family's position the way Rodrigo Borgia had to think about it. He held the papacy, the greatest office in the world and the most peculiar. It commanded no great standing army. It rested on no ancestral duchy. Every other power in Italy, Milan, Venice, Naples, Florence, sat on land and soldiers and money that passed from father to son. The papacy sat on an election, and elections end. A pope's power was immense and completely non-transferable, which meant a pope's family was immensely powerful and completely exposed. And nobody alive understood that exposure better than the man who had watched Rome hunt his relatives through the streets in 1458. So he built walls, and having no army to build them with, he built them out of his children. The first wall was Milan, and Lucrezia was its cornerstone. The Sforza alliance secured the north, bound the most aggressive military power in Italy to the papacy, and paid a political debt in the same stroke. Giovanni of Pesaro was, in himself, a minor lord of a minor town, and that was acceptable. Walls do not need to be interesting. They need to be attached to something solid. The second wall was Spain, and Juan was already sailing toward it. His marriage to Maria Enriquez, cousin of King Ferdinand, wrapped the family's secular fortune in royal Spanish protection. A Borgia now sat inside the extended family of the most formidable monarchy in Europe, holding a Spanish duchy, backed by Spanish law. Whatever happened in Italy, the reasoning ran, the house had one foot planted on ground no Italian rival could reach. The third wall was Naples, and it went up last, in May of 1494. When the reserve piece finally came out of the box, Geoffrey Borgia, the youngest, 12 or 13 years old, was married to Sancha of Aragon, an illegitimate granddaughter of the old King of Naples, and with her came titles, a principality, and a bond with the great kingdom of the Italian south. The bride was 16 or 17. Beautiful, willful, and entirely unimpressed by her child husband. And when she arrived in Rome, she brought a reputation for doing exactly as she pleased, and a gift for making the Borgia brothers compete for her attention. Rome would enjoy Sancha enormously. Her father-in-law counted her as masonry. Stand back and look at the finished structure the way an ambassador in the autumn of 1494 had to look at it. In 26 months, from a standing start, Alexander VI had bound his house to the Duchy of Milan, the Crown of Spain, and the Kingdom of Naples, 3 marriages, 3 walls, north and west and south. On parchment, no family in Italy was better defended, and every stone of the defence had been quarried from the same source. The bodies and futures of 4 young people, assigned, shipped, and contracted like provinces. Parchment was the operative word. A wall built out of a wedding is a wall built out of a promise, and promises hold only as long as the interests behind them change the interests, and the wall does not have to be stormed. It simply stops being a wall. The entire Borgia defensive system rested on one assumption so basic that nobody thought to question it: the assumption that Italy's great powers would keep being what they had always been, rivals in a stable game whose rules everyone knew. In September of 1494, the game ended. A French army came over the Alps, and every piece of parchment in Italy lost its value in a single autumn. The first thing Italians noticed about the French army was the guns. Italy knew cannon. Italian sieges had used them for decades. Huge iron bombards that had to be dragged by oxen, assembled on site, and fired a few times a day. Weapons so slow that a siege remained what it had always been, a matter of months, of starving a town while your engineers pecked at the walls. What came down through the Alpine passes in September of 1494 was a different animal: bronze guns, cast in one piece, light enough to travel on wheeled carriages at the speed of the marching column, served by professional crews who could unlimber and open fire within hours of arrival. They threw iron balls instead of stone. They fired far faster than anything Italian, and against fortress walls designed over 3 centuries for an older kind of war. The effect was not an improvement in siegecraft. It was the abolition of it. Strongholds built to hold out for a year began falling in a day. The man who owned this machine was 24 years old, stood barely 5 feet tall, and had been told since childhood that he was destined to conquer. Charles VIII of France was ungainly, impulsive, and profoundly suggestible, a young king raised on romances of chivalry, and he had convinced himself of a project his own advisers considered lunacy. The crown of Naples carried an old French claim, inherited through his father. Charles proposed to march the length of Italy and collect it, and from Naples, he dreamed aloud, he would sail east and take back Constantinople and Jerusalem itself. Sensible men in his council opposed the whole adventure. Sensible men did not have 25,000 troops and the best artillery on earth. He also had an invitation, and that detail matters, because the catastrophe about to hit Italy was ordered from inside the house. The ruler of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, uncle of the young duke and master of the duchy, in fact, was locked in a feud with the royal house of Naples and calculated that a French visit to the south would solve his problem. So Milan opened the road. The power whose alliance formed the northern wall of the Borgia fortress personally escorted the invader through the gate, and the Pope's Sforza marriage, the cornerstone laid with such expense in the Vatican a year earlier, converted overnight from a shield into a liability. Lucrezia Borgia, 13 years old, was now married into the family that had just betrayed Italy. The French came down the peninsula like water, finding a slope, Florence's strongholds surrendered. Florence itself convulsed, threw out its ruling Medici for letting the French pass, and fell under the spell of a Dominican friar. We will meet properly in the next chapter, who announced from the pulpit that the invasion was the scourge of God, arrived exactly as he had prophesied. City by city, the peninsula discovered that resistance was a form of suicide, and by Christmas the army stood at the gates of Rome. Alexander had spent the autumn hunting for allies and finding excuses. Naples was mustering far to the south. Venice declined involvement. The Pope was left holding his capital with ceremonial troops against the largest army Italy had seen in a century. And on the last day of December, 1494, he opened the gates rather than see the city stormed. For 6 hours, the French column poured through Rome by torchlight, infantry, cavalry, and the guns. Always the guns. While Romans lined the streets in silence and counted, the Pope withdrew into the Castel Sant'Angelo, the round fortress by the river, the family's old refuge, and the situation reduced itself to a very simple picture. Inside the castle, the head of the church, with a few hundred men. Outside, a king with 25,000 and artillery that opened fortresses like fruit. Then a section of the castle's outer wall collapsed. On its own, no shot had been fired at it. The masonry was old. The winter was wet. And one January day, a stretch of the ancient rampart slid down into rubble. And the diarists of Rome recorded the omen with relish, while the French guns sat in the mud outside, not yet needing to prove anything. Inside the castle, men urged the Pope to consider what everyone knew the French party wanted. Cardinal della Rovere had ridden into Rome in the king's own entourage, whispering into the royal ear. And what he whispered was deposition. Summon a council. Declare the Borgia election void for simony. Unmake the Pope. Charles held the power to attempt it, and a portion of his court pressed him daily to use it. What happened instead is the finest demonstration in this whole story of what Rodrigo Borgia actually was. Underneath the scandal and the appetite, trapped, outgunned, and disposable, he negotiated, and he negotiated the young king to a standstill. Days of talks produced a treaty that read like a French triumph. The Pope granted free passage through papal territory, surrendered key fortresses for the duration of the campaign, handed over a valuable Ottoman hostage, then in papal custody, and gave up his own son. Cesare Borgia, Cardinal of Valencia, would ride south with the French army, styled as a papal legate, functioning as a human guarantee of his father's good behavior. Notice what was missing from that treaty. The one thing Charles had actually come for. The Pope never invested him with the crown of Naples, never recognized the French claim as a right. He promised warmth, cooperation, and future discussion. And he wrapped the refusal in so much ceremony that the king rode out of Rome believing he had won. Alexander had conceded everything recoverable and conceded nothing permanent. Fortresses could be reoccupied, hostages could be recovered, and this particular hostage recovered himself 2 days south of Rome, at Velletri. The papal legate slipped out of the French camp, disguised by the story that went around at the time as a stable groom, and vanished up the road to safety. The furious French are said to have opened his baggage wagons and found them loaded with worthless decoys. The king raged about treachery. Rome told the story for weeks, and somewhere in the telling, Italy took its first real measure of the Pope's second son. 19 years old, and his idea of being a hostage lasted 48 hours. The rest of the campaign belongs in the textbooks of anticlimax. Naples fell in February with barely a fight. The Crown Charles had crossed the Alps to take simply dropping into his hands. The ease of it destroyed him, because Italy, watching the French swallow the South whole, finally panicked in unison. In March, a league crystallized. Venice, Milan itself, terrified now of the monster it had invited in, the Pope, Spain, and the Empire, and Charles understood that the peninsula was closing behind him like a trap. He marched north for home, met the League's army at Fornovo in July, fought a confused and bloody afternoon in a rainstorm, lost his baggage and his loot, and staggered on over the Alps claiming victory. Within 3 years, he was dead at 27, having struck his head on a doorframe at his own chateau, and the Naples he conquered had already slipped back out of French hands. The French left 2 things behind in Italy, and both outlasted every treaty. The first was a disease. It appeared among the troops around Naples and exploded across the peninsula in the wake of the retreating army. A horror no physician recognized, and the naming of it became a small mirror of European diplomacy. Italians called it the French disease. The French, indignantly, called it the Neapolitan disease. It was syphilis, and within a decade it was everywhere from Lisbon to Moscow. Cesare, Borgia, by the accounts of those who later saw the marks on him, carried it for the rest of his life. The second thing the French left was a lesson, and the 19-year-old who had walked out of their camp at Velletri absorbed it completely. The peninsula's old order had rested on walls, on parchment, on the polite fiction that Italian wars were games Italians controlled. The guns ended all of it in 6 months. Alliances failed, fortresses failed, and the only argument that finally counted had rolled in on bronze wheels. The Borgia fortress of marriages had proved worth exactly nothing when the pressure came, and the family's own northern wall had turned out to be the door the enemy used. A house that meant to survive in the new Italy needed more than a pope's signature and a portfolio of weddings. It needed troops of its own, and the son who had been wrapped in Cardinal silk understood that before anyone else in the family, and began, quietly, to wait for his opening. On the 7th of February, 1497, in the great square of Florence, a pyramid 60 feet high stood waiting for a torch. The Florentines had built it in tiers, like a wedding cake made out of their own possessions. Mirrors and ivory combs, carnival masks, perfumes, wikes, playing cards, dice, books of love, poetry, including, the reports insisted, volumes of Petrarch and Boccaccio, the pride of the Tuscan tongue, and paintings, canvases of beautiful women, mythologies, nudas, stacked among the vanities by the very citizens who had commissioned them, according to a tradition repeated ever since. Sandro Botticelli, the painter of the Birth of Venus, climbed the pile that day and added works from his own hand. The trumpets sounded, the choirs sang, and Florence, the richest and vainest city of the Renaissance, burned its luxuries in the public square at the command of a small, hook-nosed friar in a rough Dominican habit. His name was Girolamo Savonarola, and he owned 2 changes of clothing and the most powerful voice in Italy. He had arrived in Florence years earlier as an obscure preacher from Ferrara with a hoarse delivery and an ungainly manner, and had turned himself, sermon by sermon, into something the city had no category for. He preached doom. He preached that the church had rotted from the head, that God's patience was spent, that a sword was coming over the mountains to scourge Italy for its sins. For years the comfortable classes smiled at him. Then, in 1494, the sword actually came, on schedule, with 25,000 Frenchmen attached, and the smiling stopped, the Medici fell, the French passed through, and Florence, shaken to its foundations, turned to the one man who had seen it coming. Savonarola became the effective master of the city without holding any office at all. Florence rewrote its constitution under his guidance, proclaimed Christ the King of the city, and set about becoming something unheard of, a republic run on repentance. The transformation went deeper than bonfires. Gangs of boys in white marched the streets, knocking on doors, collecting vanities, shaming gamblers and swearers. Hymns replaced carnival songs, and week after week, in a cathedral packed with thousands, the friar climbed into the pulpit and aimed his voice south. At Rome, he never lacked material. The Pope had children, and had made one of them a cardinal at 18. The Pope had a mistress younger than his daughter. Offices were sold, dispensations were priced, and Savonarola named it all. Not in the careful subjunctives of diplomats, but in the language of the prophets. Harlots and idols and the wrath to come. Rome in his sermons became the harlot church, dressed in gold, selling the sacraments, and his listeners understood exactly which building and which man he meant. Watch how the Borgia system handled him, because the sequence is the system, displayed one tool at a time. First, the soft tool, money and honor. By reports that circulated at the time, word went from Rome in 1495 that the friar's gifts were appreciated, that a red hat could be found for him, that a man of his talents belonged inside the church's leadership rather than shouting at it. The offer of a cardinalate for the price of a gentler tone was the oldest and most reliable move in the Roman repertoire. It had worked on ambitious men for 1,000 years. Savonarola gave his answer from the pulpit to a full cathedral. A red hat. He said, "I want a hat of blood." There was no counteroffer to make after that, because there was nothing left to bid with. The man wanted martyrdom, and Rome's treasury did not stock it. Second, the administrative tool. Silence him. A papal brief ordered him to stop preaching. He stopped, briefly, then judged that God outranked the Pope and climbed back into the pulpit. Orders followed to merge his convent into a new congregation under Roman control, which would have buried him in obedience. He declined the merger. Each instrument arrived with seals and Latin and the full weight of the apostolic chancery, and each one broke against a man who had decided that the sender was not a Christian at all, but a usurper, and said so, in public, to 5,000 people at a time. Third, the spiritual weapon itself. In May of 1497, Alexander excommunicated him. For a priest, excommunication was professional death and spiritual exile, the cutting off of a soul from the sacraments and the community of the faithful. For Savonarola it was a Tuesday. He denounced the decree as invalid, the work of a broken office, and after a pause resumed saying, Mass, resumed preaching, and escalated to the final insult, announcing that the Church needed a council to depose the Pope. and writing to the crowned heads of Europe to convene one. He was now attacking not Alexander's behavior, but his legitimacy, the one target no pope of any character could ignore. And Rome's letters to Florence turned from irritation to menace. Silence this man. The city was told, or Florentine merchants abroad. Florentine trade, and the city's very access to the sacraments, would answer for him. What broke Savonarola was not Rome's pressure alone, but the oldest force in politics. Exhaustion. Florence was hungry. Plague brushed the city. The French savior king never returned, and a republic of repentance turned out to be a grim place to live, year after year. The bonfire crowds thinned. Rival preachers grew bold. In the spring of 1498, a Franciscan challenged the Dominicans to settle the question of the friar's divine mandate by the most ancient test in Christendom, trial by fire. Two men walking into the flames together to see whom God would preserve. Florence built the pyre in the great square and gathered to watch. What it got instead was a full day of delays, disputes over relics and vestments, and finally a rainstorm. And the crowd that had come for a miracle went home soaked and cheated, and its adoration curdled overnight into fury. A mob stormed the convent of San Marco the next day. The Republic's own government, reading the new weather, arrested Savonarola and put him to torture. And under torture, he signed confessions, he retracted and signed again, while papal commissioners arrived from Rome to make certain the outcome was never in doubt. On the 23rd of May, 1498, in the same square where the Vanities had burned 15 months earlier, Florence hanged Girolamo Savonarola and two of his brother friars from a scaffold built above a bonfire, then lit the fire beneath the bodies. The authorities had thought carefully about what came next. The ashes were gathered, carted to the river, and poured into the Arno, so that no follower could ever collect a bone and call it a relic. It was the government of Florence that did all this, with Rome's blessing rather than Rome's hands. A distinction the record requires, and the crowd in the square understood perfectly. The system had won, the way the system usually won, by waiting for its enemy to stumble and then arriving with paperwork. Every tool had failed against the living man. Bribery, orders, excommunication, none of it moved him an inch. What killed him was his own city's fatigue, and a rainstorm, and the victory came a year too late to matter inside the Borgia household, nearly 12 months before the scaffold in Florence. At the height of the war between the Pope and the Prophet, this family had taken a wound that no papal brief could answer. In the dark, at home, from an enemy nobody could name. It came out of the Tiber, on the end of a boatman's hook. On the morning of the 15th of June, 1497, papal officers stood on the bank of the Tiber questioning a Slavonian timber dealer named Giorgio, who slept in his boat to guard his wood, and who had seen something 2 nights earlier that he had not bothered to report. Around the 5th hour of that night, he told them, a small party came down the lane to the river, at the spot where refuse was dumped. 2 men appeared first, checking the way, then a rider on a white horse, with a dead body slung behind the saddle, the head hanging off one side and the legs off the other, held in place by 2 more men walking alongside. At the water's edge the horse was turned. The body was swung out and thrown, and when it would not sink, the men threw stones at the floating cloak until it went under. Then they left, and the night went quiet again. The officers asked the question that has preserved this man's words for 5 centuries. Why did you not report what you saw? And Giorgio, the timber dealer, answered, in effect, that in his time on that riverbank he had seen 100 bodies thrown into the Tiber at that spot, and nobody had ever come asking about any of them. 1 sentence, and the whole city stands inside it. That was Rome under the Borgias, and Rome before the Borgias, and Rome for a long time after. The river took what it was given, and no questions travelled upstream. What made this body different was the name attached to it. Because when the fishermen dragged that stretch of river later in the day, what came up on the hook? In velvet and spurs, with his gloves and his purse still on him, was Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, Captain General of the Church, the Pope's favourite son. He had been missing a day and a half. On the night of the 14th, he and his brother Cesare had dined at their mother's vineyard on the Esquiline Hill, a family supper at Vanozza's table, and had ridden back through the city together after dark. Near the palace of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, Juan reined aside. He told the party he was going elsewhere. Alone, a masked man joined him, a figure who had been seen visiting Juan for weeks. And Duke and Mask rode off into the lanes while the others went home. When his household found his bed empty in the morning, nobody panicked. When he failed to appear by nightfall, his father did. The body told its own story with unusual clarity. 9 wounds. 1 through the throat, the rest about the body, delivered by more than one hand, and the purse at his belt still held some 30 ducats, which removed, at a stroke, the most comfortable explanation. Robbers do not leave gold. Whoever killed Juan Borgia wanted him dead, only dead, and wanted Rome to know it was no robbery. The corpse was washed, dressed, and carried that night by torchlight to the family's church. And the diarists recorded the sound that came from the Vatican when the news was confirmed. The Pope, they wrote, roared, shut in his rooms. He refused food and drink from Wednesday to Saturday, and those outside the door could hear him. Grief did something to Alexander that nothing else in his long life ever did. It turned him, briefly, into a reformer. To the assembled cardinals days later he declared that the blow had come from God for the sins of the house, that he was resolved to amend his own life and the Church's, and he appointed a commission of stern cardinals to draft the cleansing of the Curia. The Reform Christendom had been begging of the papacy for a century. Drafts were actually written. They survive. Salaries for offices, limits on luxury, restraints on the sale of favours, all of it sketched in the weeks of mourning, and all of it quietly shelved as the weeks cooled. The reform of the Church lasted about as long as the Pope's fast. By August, the machine was running as before. Something else did not resume. The investigation. In the first days, the hunt for the killers had been loud and official. Arrests were expected hourly. Servants of suspect households were questioned. The city gates watched. And Rome braced for the vengeance of a father who commanded the resources of the papacy and had never in his life forgiven an injury to his family. Then, inside 2 or 3 weeks, the whole apparatus stopped. No arrests. No trial. No named culprit. Ever. The Pope let it be known that he knew who had killed his son and would not pursue it. And the words were left hanging there, unexplained, for history to gnarve on. Nothing about the case has fed speculation like that silence. A man, with every instrument of inquiry, chose not to inquire, and every writer since has filled the void with his own preferred monster. So let us do this properly, the way the rest of this story has earned. 3 layers. What was said, what can be established, and why one version outlived all the others. What was said, eventually, was Cesare, the brother. The story that conquered Europe and held the field for 4 centuries runs like this. Cesare, trapped in cardinal's robes, envied Juan, the sword, the duchy, the bride, the father's favour, and perhaps the attentions of their sister-in-law Sancha, and had him butchered to clear the road out of the church. It is psychologically delicious. It fits everything Cesare later became, and it arrives in the record years late. And from particular directions, in the weeks after the murder, with the city boiling with theories and ambassadors filing reports daily, no dispatch, no diary, no letter, names, Cesare, the accusation surfaces afterward, growing as Cesare grows, loudest in the courts of his enemies, fed by Neapolitan writers and by partisans of men he had ruined, until it hardened into the standard account precisely in the years when blaming Cesare Borgia for any corpse in Italy required no evidence at all, only plausibility, and his career supplied plausibility by the wagon load. What can be established is a shorter and more interesting list. Juan Borgia was a young man of spectacular arrogance who had spent his brief career manufacturing enemies. The year before his death, his father had given him command of the papal army against the Orsini clan, and the campaign ended in humiliation at Soriano, with the papal forces routed, Juan wounded and disgraced, and the Orsini left standing, unpunished and unforgiving. A family with a century of blood grievances against upstarts, and a fresh one against this upstart. In his final weeks, Juan had also quarrelled publicly within the Borgia orbit, and the city's earliest gossip looked hard at the household of Ascanio Sforza, near whose palace the Duke turned off into the dark. There was the Count of Mirandola, whose young daughter Juan was said to be visiting, a father with the oldest motive in the world, whose house stood near the killing ground, and there was the masked man, the one verified companion of the Duke's last ride, never identified, never found. The single thread, every investigator agreed, was real, and no investigator was allowed to pull. Then the halt, ordered from the top. One reading of that silence points outward. Toward an enemy too powerful to prosecute without a war, the papacy could not win. Most likely an Orsini vengeance. Another reading points inward, toward a truth that lay uncomfortably close to the family itself, close enough that a public trial would have destroyed the house it was meant to avenge. The record does not decide between them, and the man who could have decided took whatever he knew into his own grave 6 years later. Why did the Cesare version win anyway? Because of what happened next. Within a year of the murder, Cesare Borgia stood before the cardinals asking to be released from the church. Within 2, he wore a French dukedom and commanded an army. Within 5, he ruled a province. And everything Juan had been given in life. The secular titles, the military command, the dynastic future of the house, had passed to the brother who once watched from the edge of the room in Cardinal's red. Human beings read history backward. We see who profited, and we work toward him. Because a story with a villain is easier to carry than a story with a silence. Cesare profited beyond measure. Therefore, Cesare planned it. And the logic satisfies everyone except the record. which shows only this. A door opened in the house of Borgia on the night of the 14th of June, and the one brother built to walk through it. Walked through it. Juan was laid in the family chapel at Santa Maria del Popolo, 20 years old, mourned by a father whose roaring the whole neighborhood had heard, and across the city, in a palace full of unwanted red silk, the Pope's remaining son continued, for the moment, to dress as a cardinal, and began counting the days until he would never have to again. On the 17th of August, 1498, the College of Cardinals gathered in Rome to consider a request no cardinal in the history of the Church had ever made. Cesare Borgia, Cardinal of Valencia, 23 years old, holder of an archbishopric, of bishoprics, of abbeys, of incomes that together made him one of the richest churchmen alive, stood before his colleagues and asked to be released. His heart, he explained, had never been in the priesthood. He had accepted the red hat in obedience to his family, not to God. His soul was in danger every day. He wore robes he had no vocation for, and for the good of that soul, he begged the college to let him lay down every office, every income, and every dignity, and return to the world as a layman. The cardinals listened to this declaration of tender conscience from a man most of them privately considered the most dangerous person in Rome, and then voted to grant it. The vote was unanimous, and the unanimity had less to do with theology than with two facts. Every man in the room understood. The Pope wanted it, and the King of France wanted it, and the King of France was at that moment holding open a door the entire Borgia project intended to walk through. Here is the door, and it deserves laying out plainly, because it is one of the cleanest political transactions of the Renaissance. A three-sided deal in which every party paid in the currency the others needed. It began, as large European events so often began, in a bedroom. The new King of France, Louis XII, had inherited the throne that spring when Charles VIII died at his doorframe. Louis came to the crown, carrying a wife he did not want and lacking the wife he needed. The unwanted wife was Jean, a pious, physically deformed princess he had been forced to marry decades earlier. The needed wife was Anne of Brittany, widow of the dead king, because Anne personally owned the Duchy of Brittany, and if she left France to remarry elsewhere, the crown lost a province. Louis required an annulment, quickly, and annulments of royal marriages could be granted by exactly one man on earth, and that man had a son who wanted things only a king could give. The pieces snapped together with beautiful economy. Alexander granted the annulment. Louis got his Anne, and France kept Brittany. In return, Cesare Borgia, freshly stripped of his red, received from the French crown the Duchy of Valentinois, a real title with real lands and revenues, the promise of a royal bride, and, decisive beyond everything else, the promise of French troops for whatever the Borgias meant to do in Italy. Even the incidental details glittered. When Cesare sailed for France that autumn to collect his dukedom, his ship carried the annulment documents, and it also carried a red hat, a new cardinalate for Georges d'Amboise, the king's chief minister, whose support had smoothed every stage. Nobody involved would have used a word as crude as bribery. The machine simply ran, favor for favor, and every gear turned. Rome, watching Cesare depart, reached for its jokes, The former Cardinal of Valencia was now Duke of Valentinois, and by a small mercy of geography, the nicknames converged. Since Valencia and Valentinois collapse into the same Italian shorthand, he had been called Valentino as a churchman. He stayed Valentino as a soldier, and Italy would learn to say the name differently within 2 years. His entry into France was a spectacle the French court never let him forget. He came ashore with a train designed by his father's taste and paid for out of his father's treasury. Pages in crimson and gold, chests of jewels, mules in silver harness, and, by the stories that delighted France for a season, horses shod in silver with the shoes loosely nailed so they would scatter behind him in the streets as largesse. The French nobility, whose idea of magnificence ran to old castles and older blood, watched the parade of new money with polished contempt. They noted every excess, and behind their hands they used the phrase that followed Cesare his whole life. The priest's bastard. The court giggled. The king did not. Louis needed his Italian instrument, and through the awkward months that followed, while Cesare's promised royal bride was quietly withdrawn and a substitute negotiated, the king kept the young man close, hunted with him, and studied him. The substitute bride, in the end, exceeded the original. In May of 1499, Cesare married Charlotte d'Albret, 17 years old, sister of the King of Navarre, a princess of genuine royal blood, gentle, and by every report far too good for the marriage she had been dealt. They had one summer together. By September, Cesare rode south with the French army toward Italy, leaving Charlotte pregnant with a daughter he would never meet. She never saw her husband again. And when the time came, she wore mourning for him for the rest of her quiet life. That is Charlotte d'Albret's entire part in this story. One summer and a lifetime of black, and she deserves her sentence before the guns start. Because the guns were the entire point. Strip away the annulment, the dukedom, the wedding, and the silver horseshoes, and the transaction of 1498 comes down to a single exchange. The Pope had traded the Church's power over marriage for an army, not an alliance of parchment, of the kind the French storm had shredded 5 years earlier. Troops, cavalry, infantry, and cannon, French professionals under French captains, assigned to the service of a 24-year-old Italian duke with a target list. The family had learned the lesson of 1494 in full. In the New Italy, the argument that counted rolled in on bronze wheels, and now the Borgias could make that argument themselves. 15 months after standing before the cardinals to renounce the vanities of the world for the sake of his soul, Cesare Borgia came back over the Alps into Italy. He wore steel, he rode at the head of a French column, and he carried in his saddlebags a set of papal decrees declaring, on by on, that the lords of the cities of the Romagna had forfeited their right to rule. On Christmas Eve, 1499, in front of a crowd that filled St. Peter's and spilled back across the square, Pope Alexander VI knelt at a walled-up doorway in the basilica's porch, took a mason's hammer in his hands, and struck the bricks 3 times. Workmen finished what the hammer began. The rubble was cleared in minutes, and the Pope, candle in hand, became the first pilgrim to pass through the holy door into the church, opening the Jubilee of the year 1500. The ceremony had been prepared in detail by his master of ceremonies and approved under his authority, and in the form the crowd witnessed that night it became the template, the ritual of the sealed door, opened by the Pope's own hand at the start of the Holy Year and walled shut again at its close, was codified under this pontificate and has been followed ever since. Every 25 years, a pope opens that door in Rome while the cameras of the world watch. Americans who saw footage of the Jubilee of 2025 were watching, whether anyone mentioned it or not. A liturgy given its durable shape under Rodrigo Borgia. The Holy Year that followed was the greatest show on earth. Pilgrims converged on Rome in numbers the city could barely hold, perhaps 200,000 across the year, from Poland, from England, from Scandinavia, walking to the tombs of the apostles for the Jubilee indulgence, the great once-in-a-generation pardon of sins. They found a city scrubbed and staged for them. New streets had been cut for the crowds. The hostels overflowed. The offering chests filled. And at the center of it stood the 68-year-old Pope, magnificent in white, presiding over ceremonies of a splendor even his enemies conceded he performed superbly. Ambassadors' letters from that year read strangely doubled, half of each dispatch describing the piety of the multitudes, the other half describing the parties, the bullfights in the piazzas, the Pope's evident delight in all of it. Rome in 1500 was the capital of forgiveness, and the family that ran it stood at the height of its glory. And that is exactly the year the family began killing inside its own walls. To see it walk back across the river to the palace by St. Peter's, where the Pope's daughter lived. Because while the pilgrims streamed through the holy door, the happiest chapter of Lucrezia Borgia's life was being closed by hand. She was 19 now, and married again. What had happened to the first marriage belongs here in brief, because it set the pattern. Giovanni Sforza of Pesaro, the Milanese wall of 1493, had become politically worthless within 4 years. As Milan's star fell and the family's needs turned south, the marriage was dissolved in 1497 by the neatest legal route available, a declaration that it had never been consummated, which required Giovanni to sign a statement of his own impotence before witnesses. He signed under crushing pressure, and he spent the rest of his life repaying the humiliation with interest, telling anyone in Italy who would listen a counter-story. We will meet at this tale's third audit. File him away. The discarded husband with the wounded pride is about to become the most successful slanderer of the Renaissance. The second marriage was different, and the difference is what makes this chapter hurt. In the summer of 1498, Lucrezia was married to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisceglie, a prince of the royal house of Naples, 17 years old to her 18. The match was policy, like every Borgia match. The Naples wall rebuilt after the Milan wall crumbled, and then, against every rule of the game, the two young people did the one thing arranged marriages were never designed for. By the concurring testimony of the ambassadors, the household, and the couple's own conduct, they loved each other. A son was born in the autumn of 1499 and named Rodrigo for his grandfather for rather less than 2 years. In the middle of this story of contracts and instruments, there existed a small, genuine family, and observers noted how the Pope doted on the young couple, and everyone in Rome, except the couple themselves, could already read the problem forming over their heads. The problem was the map. Alfonso was Naples, and the Borgia project, since the great French transaction, was bound to France, and France's whole purpose in Italy was the conquest of Naples. Every mile, Cesare's French troops advanced in the north. Every step deeper into the French embrace converted the Pope's son-in-law from an ally into enemy property. Alfonso understood his own position perfectly. He had already fled Rome once in 1500 and been coaxed back for Lucrezia's sake. And he lived now in the Vatican's orbit, like a man who hears something behind him on the road at night. On the evening of the 15th of July, 1500, in the middle of the Jubilee year, Alfonso crossed St. Peter's Square after visiting the Pope, and on the steps of the Basilica, yards from the Holy Door, a group of armed men fell on him. They cut him down with wounds to the head, arm, and thigh, and were driven off before they could finish, and the young Duke was carried bleeding into the Vatican itself, where he hovered near death. Rome asked, the only question Rome ever asked, who benefits? And arrived instantly at an answer nobody said out loud. What followed inside the palace is one of the best documented sieges of nerves in the period, because the ambassadors tracked it daily. Alfonso was lodged in a tower room of the Vatican, and around his bed formed a strange, desperate garrison, Lucrezia, and her sister-in-law, Sancha, Alfonso's own sister, nursed him in shifts, and, in the detail the envoys recorded with particular care, cooked his food themselves in the sick room, on a portable stove, so that no dish would reach him from any kitchen they did not control. They feared poison. In the Vatican, under the Pope's protection, and they were the Pope's daughter and the Pope's daughter-in-law. The Pope posted guards. Neapolitan doctors were sent for. For a month the tower held, and Alfonso mended, and Rome watched the recovery, the way you watch a man climbing slowly out of a well that somebody is certainly going to push him back into. On the 18th of August it came, Cesare's captain, Miguel de Corella, called Michelotto in Italy, a Spaniard whose name recurs in this story, wherever something requires hands, entered the sick room with armed men. What happened next was reconstructed within days by the Venetian and Florentine envoys, whose dispatches substantially agree. The women were removed from the room, by one account on the pretext of an urgent papal summons. The door closed, and when Lucrezia and Sancha came back, Alfonso of Aragon was dead in his bed, and the official explanation offered to the world was that the convalescent had suffered a fatal hemorrhage from his wounds. The envoys transmitted that explanation and, in the same dispatches, transmitted what the palace itself was saying, that Michelotto had strangled the Duke where he lay. No inquiry was opened. This time, there was not even the theatre of one. The only public words from the Borgia side amounted to a justification rather than a denial, the claim that Alfonso had brought it on himself, that from his sick bed he had seen Cesare walking in the garden below and had shot a crossbow at him, and that what followed was self-defense. Believe it or not as you choose. Rome, given the choice, did not. Lucrezia's grief, vos loud, sustained, and inconvenient. She wept, the reports say, without management, shut in her rooms, until her weeping wore on her father's nerves, and within weeks she was sent out of Rome to the fortress town of Nepi, officially for her health and her mourning, with her infant son and a household in black. Something in her had finished. She was 20 years old, twice married, once widowed, and the widowing had been done by her own house, by her brother's captain, down the corridor from her father's rooms. Whatever Lucrezia Borgia believed about her family before the 18th of August, 1500, the belief she carried afterward had a scar through it, and every decision she makes for the rest of this story runs out of that scar. The Jubilee, of course, continued. The door stood open. Through the autumn, the pilgrims kept coming, tens of thousands a month, singing as they crossed the square where the assassins had waited, filing past the basilica steps that had been scrubbed of blood, on their way to the pardon of all sins. That year, hundreds of thousands of people walked through one doorway in Rome to be forgiven, a few 100 feet away, behind a different door. A sin was committed, for which no one was ever asked to seek forgiveness at all. In the last days of December, 1499, Cesare Borgia's army stood in front of the fortress of Forlì, and on the walls of that fortress, in armour, stood a woman. Her name was Caterina Sforza, and Italy had been telling stories about her for a decade. She was a granddaughter of the great soldier who founded the Sforza of Milan, and she ruled the towns of Imola and Forlì as regent for her son. And the most famous story of her life had been made on those same ramparts years earlier, when conspirators who had murdered her husband held her children hostage below the walls and threatened to kill them if she did not surrender the citadel. By the account that all Italy repeated and embellished, Caterina climbed to the battlements, raised her skirts before the assassins, and shouted down that they were fools, that she had the mould for making more. The children survived. As it happened, the conspirators did not. She hunted every one of them, and Italy filed her under a nickname that needed no explanation: the Tigress of Forlì. This was the first serious obstacle on Cesare Borgia's list, and the list itself needs a moment, because the war he had come to fight was legally unlike any other war in Italy. The Romagna was a broad, rich province running along the eastern roads from Bologna toward the Adriatic, and on every map in Europe, it belonged to the Pope. It had belonged to the Pope for centuries. On parchment. In practice, its cities had slipped one by one into the hands of local ruling families. The Malatesta in Rimini, the Manfredi in Faenza, the Riario and Sforza in Imola and Forlì, petty dynasties that held papal titles as vicars, paid Rome little or nothing, and governed as they pleased, which in most cases meant badly. Some were merely lazy tyrants. Some ran their towns as private hunting grounds, taxing at will, killing at whim. Rome had complained about them for generations, the way a landlord complains about squatters he has no bailiffs to remove. Alexander VI had bailiffs now. In the autumn of 1499, the Pope issued a decree declaring the vicars of the Romagna in default of their obligations and their titles forfeit, which transformed, with one stroke of ink, a family land grab into the lawful repossession of church property. Nobody in Italy was fooled, and nobody needed to be. The beauty of the operation was that hypocrisy and legality pointed the same direction. The lords of the Romagna were genuinely usurpers, genuinely oppressive, and genuinely due for eviction, and the fact that their evictor meant to keep the property for his own family did not make the eviction papers any less valid. Cesare rode north with French lances, papal money, and a clean, legal conscience, a combination very few conquerors in history have enjoyed. Imola opened its gates almost at once. The city had no appetite for dying on behalf of Caterina's unpopular son, and the pattern that would carry Cesare through the whole campaign showed itself immediately. The towns surrendering ahead of the siege guns, negotiating terms, discovering that the new lord's terms were rather better than the old lord's peace. Forli's city followed, but Caterina withdrew into the citadel of Ravaldino, the strongest fortress in the province, stocked for a siege, and dared him to come and take it. And for 3 weeks in the dead of winter, the tigress and the duke fought the first real battle of the Borgia wars. She commanded her own artillery. She repaired breaches by night. She held out, by the reckoning of impressed observers, across Italy, longer than any of her male neighbours would manage. And when the final assault came through the shattered wall on the 12th of January, 1500, the fighting inside ran hand to hand for hours before she was taken, sword within reach, among her last defenders. Cesare sent her to Rome a prisoner. She was held in the Castel Sant'Angelo, released after a year and a half under French pressure, and lived out her days in Florence among her medicines and her grandchildren, having lost everything except the legend. The campaign rolled on, interrupted once when Milan's collapse briefly recalled the French troops, then resumed at full weight. Pesaro fell without a fight in October of 1500, and the manner of its falling deserves its sentence, because the lord who fled before Caesar's advance, without risking a skirmish, was Giovanni Sforza, the discarded first husband of Lucrezia Borgia, the man spending his exile authoring slanders about the family. He ran from the brother-in-law he had wronged on paper, and Cesare took his town without dismounting. Rimini surrendered days later, its Malatesta lord, selling out and clearing off, unmourned. Faenza was different, and Faenza is where the campaign shows both of its faces at once. The little city was ruled by Astore Manfredi, a lord of 16 whose family had governed mildly enough that the people actually loved him. And when the Borgia army arrived, Faenza did what no other town in the Romagna did. It fought. Through the winter of 1501, citizens and garrison together held their obsolete walls against modern guns, for no strategic reason at all, purely for the boy, and Italy watched with a kind of embarrassed admiration. When the town finally capitulated in April, the terms were honourable, and the terms included the safety of Astore Manfredi. He was received courteously, kept for a time in the Duke's train, and then sent to Rome, to the Castel Sant'Angelo, and about a year later his body was found in the Tiber, the river again. No explanation was ever offered. A surrendered boy whose only crime was being loved by his city went into the water weighted like refuse. And anyone hoping this story will make its subjects likable should stop at Faenza and reread the terms of surrender. And yet, and this is the fact that made Cesare Borgia a subject of study for 5 centuries rather than a footnote of villainy, the province he was seizing by these methods began, almost immediately, to be governed better than anyone alive could remember it being governed. The change was practical and it was fast. The roads, infested for generations by bandits operating under lords who took a percentage, were swept and made safe. And merchants noticed within months the chaos of local tolls and arbitrary taxes gave way to uniform administration. Courts that had been instruments of each town's ruling clan were subordinated to a central appellate tribunal for the whole province, staffed by professional jurists, where a peasant suit against a nobleman could actually be heard. Cesare recruited talent wherever he found it and paid it well. And in the summer of 1502, the talent included a 50-year-old Florentine engineer he engaged as his architect and general inspector of fortresses, with a passport ordering all commanders to give him free passage and every assistance. The engineer walked the walls of the Romagna cities with a notebook, sketching improvements, and drew for his employer a map of Imola, so precise, so far beyond the cartography of the age, that it looks like the work of a man who had somehow seen the town from the sky. The engineer was Leonardo da Vinci. The greatest mind of the era spent a season on the payroll of the era's most feared man, measuring his walls, and the map survives, and you can look at it today and feel the strangeness of that partnership in every perfect line. Order, roads, courts, Leonardo and Ramiro de Lorca hold both halves, because Cesare built them as one system. Ramiro de Lorca was the Spanish captain Cesare, installed as governor to break the Romagna to obedience, and Ramiro did it in Ramiro's way, with executions, confiscation, and a delight in cruelty that within 2 years made his name a curse in every market town of the province. Complaints accumulated. Cesare let them. Then, in the last days of December 1502, with the province pacified and the governor's usefulness spent, Ramiro was arrested in Cesena on his master's order, and on the morning of the 26th, the citizens of Cesena came into their central piazza and found him there, executed, his body displayed with the block and the knife set beside it. There was no proclamation and no explanation. The arrangement itself was the message, and the town was left to read it. A Florentine envoy was in Cesena that week, and he recorded the crowd's reaction in a line that has never been improved on as a summary of Borgia government. The people, he wrote, were left at once satisfied and stupefied. Satisfied, because the man who had tormented them was dead, and their new lord had killed him for it. Stupefied, because the lord delivering this justice was the same man who had aimed Ramiro at them in the first place. That envoy would spend the rest of his life thinking about that morning. We will meet him properly in the next chapter, because he had already been watching Cesare at close range for 3 months, and taking notes. By the beginning of 1503, the conquest was substantially complete. The petty dynasties were gone, fled, or dead. The cities were garrisoned, administered, taxed, and quiet. A new state existed in the middle of Italy, with a functioning government and a professionalizing army, ruled by a duke not yet 28 years old, and the powers of Europe had begun addressing that duke not as the Pope's son, but as a fact on the map. For the first time, the Borgia Empire existed somewhere other than Rodrigo's imagination. On a night in October 1502, in a draughty room in the fortress town of Imola, a 33-year-old Florentine civil servant sat writing a dispatch by candlelight, trying to explain to his government a man he could not stop watching. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli. He was the second chancellor of the Republic of Florence, a salaried official of middling rank, chronically underpaid, sharp-tongued, and very good at his job, which was diplomacy of the unglamorous kind, the gathering and weighing of information. Florence had sent him to the court of Cesare Borgia because Florence was afraid. The Duke's new state sat directly on the Republic's border. His army was growing. His intentions were unreadable. Machiavelli's instructions amounted to a single anxious question repeated in official language. find out what he is going to do to us. And so the Florentine took up residence in the Duke's travelling court, and for the next 3 months he enjoyed, without knowing it, the most consequential ringside seat in the history of political thought. His dispatches from those months survive, and they read like nothing else in Renaissance diplomacy. Because the writer keeps forgetting to be bored, Machiavelli had spent years among princes, and princes were, professionally speaking, predictable. They postured, they consulted, they delayed, they leaked. This one did none of it. The Duke, Machiavelli, reported, decided at speed and moved before his decisions could be discussed, kept his plans sealed inside his own head, worked through the night and slept through mornings, said little, and when he did speak, spoke with a directness that made ambassadors flinch. The envoy's letters home circle the same observation again and again, phrased with growing respect and a note of something like alarm. This man does what he says he will do, and tells nobody what that is until it is done. Machiavelli had arrived, as it happened, in the middle of the gravest crisis of Cesare's career, which meant he got to watch the Duke operate with everything at stake. The crisis was a mutiny. Cesare's swift conquests had been won substantially with borrowed muscle. The private armies of hired captains, condottieri in the Italian trade, and the captains had done their arithmetic. Most of them were petty lords themselves. Vitellozzo, Vitelli of Città di Castello, members of the great Orsini clan, the Baglioni of Perugia, men of exactly the class. Cesare was exterminating city by city. Every campaign they fought for him conquered somebody like themselves. In the first days of October, 1502, the principal captains met at a castle called La Magione, near Perugia, and agreed to strike before they were struck. The revolt hit fast, and it hurt. Fortresses in the Romagna were betrayed and seized. A column of the Duke's loyal troops was ambushed and cut up. For a few weeks that autumn, half of Italy expected the Borgia state to come apart at the seams, and the courts of the peninsula began composing their condolences with satisfaction. What Machiavelli watched instead, from inside Imola, was a demonstration. No panic reached the Duke's face or his correspondence. Cesare had money, and he spent it, hiring fresh companies until the loss of the mutineers' troops was made good and better than good. He had France, and he invoked it, and the mere rumour of French lances moving his way began to soften the conspiracy's resolve, and he had the conspirators' own natures, which he understood down to the ground. They were not a brotherhood. They were frightened rivals, bolted together by a shared nightmare, and the moment their opening blows failed to kill him, each began privately calculating his separate way back into favour. Cesare received their envoys one at a time. He was warmth itself, misunderstandings. He agreed. All of it misunderstandings between old comrades. Terms were drafted, pardon written, commands restored. By the end of November, the revolt of La Magione had dissolved into an embarrassed reconciliation, and the captains had agreed to prove the restored friendship by joining the Duke in a new joint operation, the capture of the Adriatic port of Senigallia. Machiavelli's dispatches from those weeks record the reconciliation and record, between the lines, his refusal to believe a word of it. He had taken the Duke's measure by now. Everyone had, except the men who mattered. Senigallia surrendered in the last days of December, arranged in advance, with one condition attached that should have screamed in the night. The citadel's castellan insisted he would hand his keys to Cesare in person and to nobody else. So the captains gathered in the town to await their employer. And on the 31st of December, 1502, the sequence unfolded that Machiavelli would later write up, at his government's request, as a formal account, almost a technical manual, of how such things are done. Cesare arrived with his army in marching order and met the captains outside the walls with embraces, riding into town together. The party came to the house prepared for the Duke, and he drew the captains inside with him for a private word among friends. The door closed. In the room beyond stood Michelotto and the guard, Vitellozzo, Vitelli and Oliverotto da Fermo. A young captain who had once seized his own city by massacring his uncle's dinner party, was seized, and that night, back to back, by the accounts that circulated, they were strangled. The two Orsini captains were held under guard while riders galloped for Rome, and this is the detail that lifts Senigallia out of the category of a camp murder into something new. The strike was synchronized. On the signal, the Pope in Rome moved the same hours against the Orsini within his reach, arresting the head of the clan, the Cardinal himself. At the Vatican, father and son closed both jaws of a single trap, 70 years old and 27, 150 miles apart, on the same day's schedule, and when confirmation arrived from Rome, the two captive Orsini captains followed their colleagues into the dark. The clan that had murdered its way through Roman politics for centuries. The clan, many still believed, had killed Juan Borgia on that June night 5 years earlier, was broken in a week, its strongholds falling to papal troops through January. Italy's reaction is the part a modern audience has to sit with. There was no outcry. There was applause. Letters of congratulation flowed to the Duke from the chanceries of the peninsula, praising the elegance of the operation. And Isabella d'Este, the most cultivated woman in Italy and an arbiter of taste for a continent, sent Cesare a gift of carnival masks with her compliments on his splendid deeds. The joke was refined, and the joke was admiring. Contemporaries did not ask whether the trap at Senigallia was moral. They asked whether it was well made, and agreed that it was the way you agree about a bridge or a sonnet. That was the world these people actually lived in. And no account of the Borgias is honest that pretends the family was uniquely monstrous within it. They were simply better at the common game. And Senigallia was the proof, admired as proof. Machiavelli filed his reports and rode home to Florence in January. And the ordinary tragedy of his life then proceeded. 10 years later, the republic he served collapsed. The Medici came back, and the second chancellor was dismissed, wrongly implicated in a conspiracy, tortured, and released to rot on his farm outside the city. It was there, in exile from the work he loved, that he wrote the short book that made his name a byword in every language of Europe. The Prince is many things, but at its center, offered explicitly as the model for any man who would seize and hold a new state, stands one figure, studied from life by candlelight in Imola and Cesena and Senigallia. Machiavelli names him, praises his methods in detail, the uses of cruelty well applied, the management of faithless allies, the morning's display in the piazza at Cesena, and delivers through him the book's cold, famous counsel, that since love and fear can rarely live together, it is far safer for a prince to be feared than loved. 5 centuries have kept that book continuously in print. Kings, revolutionaries, dictators, presidents, and business school students have read it, and everyone who has ever called a ruthless operator Machiavellian is, without knowing it, remembering Cesare Borgia. The Duke would lose everything within 2 years of Senegalia. The method never lost again. In the first week of January, 1502, a wedding procession, nearly 1,000 strong, rode out of Rome into the snow, heading north, and, at the center of it, on horseback, rode a 21-year-old widow whose name was known in every court and every tavern in Europe. Lucrezia Borgia was going to Ferrara, to her third marriage. The first had ended in an annulment built on a public humiliation. The second had ended under Michelotto's hands in a Vatican sick room. The third had been negotiated for a year with the ferocity of a treaty between hostile powers, which is what it was, and that negotiation is worth telling before the procession clears the gates, because nothing in the Borgia record shows the machinery of this family, and the price of belonging to it. Quite so nakedly, the House of Este had ruled Ferrara for 3 centuries. They were everything the Borgias were not. Ancien, secure, respectable, one of the oldest dynasties in Italy. And when the Pope first proposed his daughter for Alfonso d'Este, heir to the duchy, the reaction in Ferrara was open dismay. The old Duke, Ercole, did not want the Pope's daughter. The heir did not want her. The family's letters from those months discuss the match the way you discuss a tax. An affliction to be resisted, and then, if resistance fails, priced. Ferrara's objections were dynastic, and they were personal, because by 1501, the name Lucrezia Borgia carried a cargo of scandal unmatched by any woman's name in Europe. We will open that cargo in a moment and weigh what was actually in it. Resistance failed, because the map made it fail. Cesare's new state now bordered Ferrara. French favour sat with the Borgias. An Este refusal would have left the duchy alone, encircled and insulted. So old? Ercole did what proud houses do when cornered. He named a price meant to sting. 100,000 ducats of dowry in coin, a fortune that stunned observers. Reduction of Ferrara's annual tribute to the church to a token. Castles, benefices, favors. Each item haggled to the last coin, with the old Duke raising his demands whenever Rome showed eagerness. The Pope groaned at the total, called Ercole a shopkeeper, and paid every ducat. He needed the northern anchor for Cesare's Romagna, and he needed, on the evidence of his own conduct, something less strategic than that. He was placing his daughter at last beyond reach of the wreckage, in the one kind of house whose walls did not depend on any pope's heartbeat. So the procession went north in the snow, with trousseau chests and cardinals and musicians, and while it travels, let us do what this story has twice done already. The name riding at the center of that column had become, in 21 years, a legend with 3 heads. Time to audit all 3. What was said came to this: that Lucrezia Borgia was a poisoner, mistress of a hollow ring, from which she dosed the wine of inconvenient guests, that the Vatican, under her family, hosted entertainments beyond parody, the most notorious being a banquet in the autumn of 1501, at which courtesans performed for the Pope's court in scenes that made the story immortal in whispers. And, worst of all, an accusation of incest aimed at her father and her brother, repeated across Europe for 5 centuries. What can be established is a different inventory. And the difference is the point. Begin with poison. In the entire documentary record of the period, the dispatches, the diaries, the court proceedings of a dozen states that watched this family with hostile attention, there is not one death attributed at the time, by anyone, to Lucrezia Borgia, not one suspected cup. The poison ring is literature, assembled centuries later by playwrights and novelists. Victor Hugo, above all, whose 1833 drama gave the world a Lucrezia who murders by chalice, and Donizetti set the play to music, and the opera fixed the image beyond correction. The incest accusation has a birth certificate, and we have already met the father of it. When the Sforza marriage was dissolved in 1497 on the grounds of non-consummation, Giovanni Sforza was made to sign away his manhood before witnesses to save the alliance's paperwork, and the humiliation demanded revenge. His revenge was a sentence, spoken to his Sforza kinsmen, and through them to all Italy, that the Pope had taken his daughter for himself. It was the perfect slander, unprovable, unforgettable, aimed at 2 reputations at once, and it landed in a city already primed to believe anything of the Borgias, a mysterious child born within the family's orbit around 1498, acknowledged in 2 contradictory papal documents that assigned him first to Cesare and then, secretly, to the Pope, kept the story fed for years. The likeliest explanation of that muddle is another illegitimate birth inside the Borgia circle, being given legal standing by a father who kept changing his mind about which fiction to use. The record has never conclusively closed the question. What it does show is where the accusation came from, and who was holding the grudge that produced it. The banquet of 1501 stands on exactly one leg. A single source describes it. The private diary of Johann Burchard, the Vatican's German master of ceremonies. A dry recorder of protocol whose entry for that October evening runs a few clinical lines. No ambassador reported it, and the ambassadors of Venice and Florence and Mantua reported everything, every party, every rumor, every stain on this family, eagerly, for years. Their silence about the most reportable evening of the pontificate is loud. Burchard was not an eyewitness to much of what he logged, and his diary absorbed the talk of the palace corridors. Perhaps something coarse happened that night in Cesare's apartments. Perhaps corridor talk inflated a soldier's party into legend. The honest verdict is a shrug, and the honest observation is that the story's survival never depended on its truth. It survived because it was perfect. Everything Europe wanted to believe about this family, compressed into one scene, which brings us to why all of it survived. And the answer is that Lucrezia was the one member of the family the legend could be safely hung on. Her father held the keys of heaven, and her brother held an army. She held nothing. A woman in that age could be written about with an impunity no man of power permitted, and every slander aimed at her wounded the Pope and the Duke without risking their revenge. The men were made into monsters in the telling. The woman had to be made into something worse, because her real record, the record of contracts and household books, was fatally unsensational. Strip the legend, and what remains is a girl marketed at 11, married at 13, annulled at 17, widowed by murder at 20, and, in between, entrusted twice by her father with responsibilities extraordinary for a young woman in the government of the Papal States. In 1499, at 19, she was made governor of the city of Spoleto, a papal appointment with real civil authority. In the summer of 1501, leaving Rome for weeks, Alexander left his daughter in his own apartments with authority to open his correspondence and handle the ordinary business of the office. With instructions to the cardinals to assist her, ambassadors reported the arrangement with disbelief. The most slandered woman in Europe was, on the actual evidence, one of the very few people her father trusted with the routine work of his own desk. The procession reached Ferrara in February, and the city that had haggled so bitterly against her arrival lined the streets to look. And what it saw, over the following months, it slowly, grudgingly, began to like. That story belongs to the last chapter of this one. Here, only the departure matters. And one fact about it, plain in the record and worth leaving plain. Lucrezia Borgia rode out of Rome in January 1502 into the snow, 21 years old. She never entered the city again as long as she lived. In Rome she had been the Pope's daughter, a murdered man's widow, and the lead character in stories other people wrote about her. In Ferrara, for the first time, she would hold the pen. The family she left behind had one more summer coming, and the summer was already on the calendar. Stand back, in the early summer of 1503, and look at the whole board the way the chanceries of Europe were looking at it. Rome held the Pope, 72 years old, and by every account still vigorous. Presiding over a college of cardinals he had methodically restocked, Spaniards and dependents filling the seats of dead and fled Italians, a majority built for the one vote that mattered next. The old baronial clans that had terrorized popes for centuries, broken, the Colonna, dispossessed, the Orsini, shattered since Senigallia, their castles confiscated, their cardinal dead in a papal cell of causes. Nobody investigated, and everybody assumed. The Romagna held, garrisons paid, roads safe, courts sitting, a functioning state where a robber's corridor had been, under a duke of 27, whom the King of France called cousin, and the Pope called son, Fihara, bound by marriage, Tuscany, intimidated, the treasury, full, and here the accounting requires the same honesty as everything else in this story, because the money paying those garrisons came out of the machine running at maximum cynicism. In the spring of 1503 the Pope created 9 new cardinals at a stroke, and the appointments were openly priced, and the proceeds ran to something like 130,000 ducats. Weeks earlier, one of the richest members of the college, the Venetian Cardinal Machiavelli, had died suddenly after 2 days of violent illness, and his entire fortune was absorbed by the papal treasury before the body cooled. Rome drew its conclusion at the time and said it quietly. Years later, under a hostile successor, a servant would confess, under torture, to poisoning the cardinal at Borgia instruction, a confession extracted to please the new management, and therefore worth exactly as much as such confessions are worth. What is certain is the sequence in the ledgers. A rich man died, and the state that needed his money got all of it, and the state's reputation was such that nobody anywhere considered coincidence worth discussing. Now put the ambassadors' eyes on it, because their letters that season are the best measure of how far this family had come. The Venetian envoy reported that the Pope had grown so powerful in Italy that the great houses no longer troubled to resist him, only to survive him. When Cesare rode through Rome, he moved inside a wall of Spanish and Romagnol troops in his own livery, and the streets emptied ahead of him, and the ambassadors noted that the cardinals in the city, princes of the church, every one, waited on the duke's convenience for appointments and took what hours he gave them. There is a small scene from that spring worth holding on to. The duke's daily rhythm had inverted itself entirely. He conducted business through the night and slept into the afternoon. And Rome, which had run on the sun since the Caesars, simply rearranged itself around his hours. Petitioners waited past midnight. Envoys of kings sat in antechambers at 2 a.m. for an audience that might or might not come. A city adjusts its clocks for very few people. That was the machine in the summer of 1503. Sacred office, family sword, dynastic marriages, packed college, full treasury, each part feeding the others, the whole engine turning more smoothly than papal power had turned in living memory. Ambassadors writing home that season struggled against their own disbelief, describing a papacy transformed into something none of their grandfathers would have recognized. A hereditary-looking, army-bearing, territory-holding dynasty in everything except the one detail of law no bull and no army could amend. The office at the center of it could not be inherited. Every other crown in Europe passed by blood. This one passed by election. Among the very men the family had bribed, bullied, and buried for a decade. And the whole structure, the duchy, the garrisons, the marriages, the fear, hung from the single thread of one old man's pulse. Nobody understood that thread better than the two men it held, and their answers to it were characteristically their own. The Pope's answer was the college, seat by seat, Spaniard by Spaniard. The electorate itself rebuilt so that even death would find the machine rigged. The son's answer was steel and stone, the Romagna fortified, the army made permanent, the state given bones strong enough, perhaps, to stand through the dangerous weeks. A papal death would open. Perhaps Cesare had run the calculation cold, and would say so afterward in the sentence history remembers him by, he had provided, he believed, for every single thing that could happen on the day his father died. He had a motto in those years, stamped on his sword, woven into his ceremonial dress, flaunted with the confidence of a man betting everything on one name: out Caesar, out nihil, either Caesar or nothing. Rome read it as arrogance. At this distance, it reads more like an actuarial statement. The two columns of the family ledger, with nothing written in between. June passed into July, and the Roman summer arrived on schedule, and with it the season Romans genuinely feared. Heat pooled in the low city along the river. The marshes outside the walls breathed their nightly vapour, and the fever came, as it came every August, culling the poor first and then climbing. Anyone who could leave Rome in August left. Cardinals scattered to hill towns. The rich shuttered their palaces. The Borgias stayed. Because the game that summer was at a delicate point. French and Spanish armies converging on Naples. The family's next great pivot, half negotiated. Business everywhere, and none of it finishable from a country villa. They stayed, and worked, and sweated, and accepted the ordinary risk of a Roman August. The risk their city ran every year and mostly survived. The Pope had built an empire around an office his family could never inherit, and the man holding that office had just accepted a dinner invitation for the first days of August at a vineyard in the hills outside the walls. Now come back to the vineyard, where this story began. In the first days of August, 1503. This time, you know everyone at the table. The host, Cardinal Adriano de Corneto, freshly promoted, one of the 9 red hats sold that spring, a man who owed his rank to the family dining under his pergola and whose fortune Rome assumed the family would eventually collect. The old man in the place of honor, Alexander VI, 72, master of the machine, days short of the 11th anniversary of his election, in high spirits that summer by every report, his son's state secure, his treasury full, his enemies dead, exiled, or waiting, and the Duke, Cesare, 27, the sword of the house, deep in the manoeuvring between France and Spain over Naples, carrying in his head the timetables of half the armies in Italy. Wine was brought up cool from the cellars against the heat. The evening ran late, in the open air, in the hills, where the air was supposed to be safer than the air of the low city. That is the entire documented event. A dinner party in August. Everything else is what happened next, and what Rome decided it meant. Within the week, the host was ill with fever. Then the Pope was ill. Then the Duke was ill. Worse than either. And Rome, watching the whole head table of Christendom go down together, produced its explanation at the speed of the streets. The wine. The Borgias had come to that dinner carrying poison for their host, meaning to harvest one more rich cardinal's estate, and by the justice of heaven or the fumbling of a servant, the flask had been switched. And the poisoners had drunk their own vintage. Within days the story had names, quantities, and dialogue. Within weeks it was in diplomatic dispatches. Within a generation it was in the histories, polished into the perfect ending. The family of poisoners poisoned at their own table, and it has survived 500 years, because no other ending could possibly be as satisfying. The Pope fought his fever for nearly 2 weeks. The physicians bled him. The reports from the sick room swung between hope and alarm, and on the evening of the 18th of August, 1503, after receiving the last rites, Rodrigo Borgia died in the apartments under Pinturicchio's painted bulls, a few steps from the room where he had been elected 11 years and 1 week earlier. What happened to his body over the following 2 days did more for the poison legend than any rumor could. The August heat did its ordinary work with extraordinary speed, and the master of ceremonies, Burchard, the same dry diarist we have met before, recorded the result with the appalled precision of a professional whose protocols were collapsing around him. The corpse blackened and swelled beyond recognition, and the workmen who forced the remains into a coffin too small for them labored without ceremony, alone, because the court had scattered and nobody of rank would stay in the room. Rome heard the descriptions and drew the obvious conclusion. A body that turned black was a poisoned body. Everyone knew it, the way everyone knows things that are not true. So run the audit, the last one, the one this whole story has been waiting for. What was said you have already heard. The switched flask, the family destroyed by its own instrument, heaven's own irony. It was the version Rome wanted, the version Europe repeated. and the version that carried the Borgia name into legend. What can be established is quieter and, in its way, more final. It was August. In Rome, in an era before anyone knew what actually bred in the marshes around the city, the Roman fever was an annual institution, a killer with a season, and its very name became our word, malaria. From the Italian malaria, the bad air that everyone blamed, the nightly exhalation of the swamps. The summer of 1503 was a savage fever season, even by Roman standards, with sickness general in the city and deaths throughout the court, a fact the ambassadors recorded before anyone at the vineyard fell ill. The timing fits the disease with textbook neatness. A dinner in the hills in mosquito season, then a week of incubation, then fevers striking the dinner party one by one, the old man dying, the young man surviving. No known poison of the period behaves that way, waiting 7 days, then killing one guest, sparing another after a near-fatal struggle, and brushing a third. And the horror of the corpse proves nothing but the calendar. Bodies in Roman Augusts decayed fast, always had, and the physicians of the day knew it even as the crowd read the blackened face as a confession. Some historians over the centuries have kept a small door open for poison, and honesty keeps it ajar. But the plain reading of the evidence, the reading most modern scholarship accepts, is that the most notorious poisoning in European history was, in all likelihood, a mosquito bite. Why did the poison version survive, anyway? Against the calendar and the medicine, because nobody wanted the truth's proportions. A family that had bent kingdoms, bought the papacy, conquered a province, and filled the Tiber with its enemies, could not be permitted to end by insect. The legend demanded symmetry. The poisoners poisoned, and symmetry is cheaper than accuracy and lasts longer. The Borgias had spent 11 years teaching Europe they were capable of anything. Europe returned the compliment by refusing to believe that nature, unassisted, had done what no king could do. Every army in Italy, every rival clan, every sworn enemy of that house had failed. A march outside the walls succeeded in a week. The machine's response to its founder's death was, for a few hours, flawless, and the flawlessness belonged to Cesare, burning with fever 2 floors away. Unable to stand, he ran the first moves through Michelotto like a man playing chess by messenger. Before the death was even announced, his men sealed the papal apartments and forced the treasurer to surrender the keys, and the coin, plate, and jewels of the papacy, a fortune in portable value, came out of the vaults and into Borgia custody, ahead of the mob that always looted a dead pope's rooms. The garrisons held. The orders went out. For a day or two, watching the Duke's men move with their usual precision, Rome could believe the machine might survive the mechanic. Then the city began to correct itself. At speed, in the old direction, the Orsini and Colonna, broken and dispossessed, were back in Rome under arms within days, reclaiming palaces, hunting Spaniards through the streets with a relish their grandfathers would have recognized, and the Catalan hunting of 1458 replayed itself half a century on, as though the city had merely been holding its breath. The Spanish cardinals dug in around the coming conclave. French and Spanish armies both edged toward Rome, and in the middle of it lay the one man whose presence might have held the structure together. Sweating through the crisis weeks flat on his back, alive, lucid, and immobilized. He said it himself. Afterward, to the one chronicler, guaranteed to write it down. When Machiavelli came to observe him again that autumn, Cesare returned more than once, almost compulsively, to the same bitter accounting. He had thought of everything, he said. Against the day of his father's death, he had provided for every contingency, arranged every piece, prepared for every enemy. The one thing he had never imagined was that when his father lay dying, he would be dying too. The house had been built to survive the death of the Pope. It never occurred to anybody that both pillars could crack in the same week. The machine was designed so there would never be a vacuum at the top. The summer of 1503 produced two vacuums at once, one on the throne of St. Peter, and one in the body of the only man who could have filled the first. In the last days of October, 1503, the cardinals filed into conclave in Rome for the second time in a month, and, through the door, at the head of the strongest faction, walked a face from the beginning of this story. Giuliano della Rovere was 60 years old now. He had lost the great conclave of 1492 to Borgia money, spent the decades since in exile and intrigue, ridden into Rome once behind a French king, hoping to see his enemy deposed, and outweighted everything. The wolf's son, the entire pontificate that should have been his. The first conclave after Alexander's death had produced a frail compromise pope who lasted 26 days. Now the field was clear, and Della Rovere ran the race like a man who had spent 11 years studying the winner's methods. He promised, he traded, he guaranteed offices, legations, and protections with a fluency that would have made Alexander smile in recognition. And he did the one thing nobody in Italy thought possible. He cut a deal with Cesare Borgia, the Duke, recovering now but politically naked, still commanded one asset: the votes of the Spanish cardinals his father had created. Della Rovere needed them, and the price he offered was everything Cesare had left to want: confirmation as Captain General of the Church, support for his rule in the Romagna, a place inside the new order. The sworn enemy of the House of Borgia made these promises to the son of the man he had hated most in the world. And Cesare, the master of the false reconciliation, the architect of Senegalia, looked at an offer from the one man in Italy with a lifetime of reasons to destroy him, and took it, Machiavelli, back in Rome for the conclave, recorded his astonishment that the Duke of all men believed it. On the 1st of November, 1503, Della Rovere was elected Pope almost by acclamation, taking the name Julius II, and the promises to Cesare Borgia began dying before the smoke cleared. What followed was not a war. It was a repossession, and it moved with the speed of everything in this story's final act. Julius demanded the surrender of the Romagna fortresses. Cesare refused and was arrested. In the Vatican, in the palace where he had grown up, the fortress commander's loyalty was tested and broken castle by castle. The new state, the courts and the roads and the garrisons, the whole machine, passed into the hands of the church it had nominally been built for, which is to say, into the hands of Julius, who spent the rest of his pontificate wearing armor and finishing, for the papacy, exactly the work Cesare had begun for the Borgias. There is no evidence he ever acknowledged the debt. Released and rearrested through a year of maneuvering, Cesare was finally shipped to Spain, a prisoner, and locked in the castle of La Mota, on the high plains of Castile, in a cell, in a tower. He went out the window, in the autumn of 1506, with a rope smuggled to him. The Duke went down the tower wall, and the rope was short, and he fell the last distance far enough to break bones, and his confederates dragged him onto a horse and rode, injured, hunted, and penniless. He crossed half of Spain to the small kingdom of Navarre, where his wife's brother was king. And there, the man who had commanded the armies of the church took service as a mercenary captain in a border quarrel, because it was the only work left in the world for what he was. The last morning came on the 12th of March, 1507. Outside the walls of a town called Viana, there had been a night alarm, a relief column slipping into the besieged castle in bad weather, and at first light Cesare rode out at the head of a pursuit and drew ahead of his own men. Alone, the way he had ridden ahead of everyone his whole life. A party of enemy knights caught him in a ravine. They did not know who he was. He fought them by himself, and they killed him with a count of wounds, the reports set above 20, and then, as the custom of the battlefield allowed, they stripped the richly armoured stranger of everything, the armour, the clothes, all of it, and left him on the stones. He was 31 years old, the man who had made Italy hold its breath, the model of the modern prince, the son for whom a pope had bent the church across his knee, was found by his own soldiers as an anonymous corpse in a gully, and the men who killed him learned only afterward what their morning's work had been. Either Caesar or nothing. Inside 4 years the motto had settled its own account, and taken the second column. The news travelled the courts of Europe, and it was carried to Ferrara, and a woman of 26 shut herself in her rooms with it. Lucrezia Borgia had every reason on earth to receive the death of Cesare with something other than grief. He had strangled her husband, or ordered it done, in a room she had just been sent out of. Her household heard her praying through that night, repeating one word, and the word was his name. Then she came out and went back to work. The work Lucrezia Borgia went back to, on the morning after she finished praying for her brother, was the government of a duchy. She had come to Ferrara as a scandal the Este family had to be paid to accept. She spent 17 years there, and by the end of them the city belonged to her as thoroughly as any Este had ever belonged to it. Her husband, Alfonso d'Este, was a soldier and an artilleryman who spent long stretches of those years at war. And in his absences, the Duchess governed. She sat in council. She heard petitions. She signed and decided in his name. And the surviving correspondence shows a woman doing routine administrative work competently and without drama, which is the least legendary and most revealing thing in her file. She ran her own estate so well that she rebuilt her personal finances after Rome's collapse took her family's money with it, invested in land, drainage, and agriculture in the marshy country around the city, and founded convents. She made her court a refuge for poets and scholars, corresponded for years with Pietro Bembo, the poet and future Cardinal, in letters that survive as some of the loveliest in Italian, and was mourned by artists as a patroness and by the poor of Ferrara as a protectress. In June of 1519, at 39, she died of complications after the birth of her 10th child, having written a calm farewell letter to the Pope days earlier, asking his blessing. Her husband, who was not a sentimental man, wrote to his nephew that he could not write of it without tears. Ferrara went into mourning, and the mourning was not protocol. Of the 4 children raised in that house across the Tiber, she was the only one granted an ordinary death. In a bed, in old company, grieved by a city. In this family, an ordinary death was the rarest achievement of all. The empire was gone by then, so completely that travellers crossing the Romagna a decade after Senegalia found barely a trace it had existed. The duchy dissolved. The marriages outlived their purpose. The treasure scattered. The Spanish cardinals dispersed, and every acre and office reverted to the machine that had produced them. 11 years of building, and within 4 years of the fever, there was nothing on any map to show for it. And then the name did something nobody watching the collapse could have predicted. It escaped through 2 doors. The first door was a book, Niccolò Machiavelli, dismissed and disgraced when Florence changed hands, sat on his farm in the evenings in his good clothes, as he told a friend in a famous letter, and conversed with the ancients, and wrote The Prince, and built its central chapters around the duke he had watched by candlelight in Imola. The failure at the end, Machiavelli argued, proved nothing against the method, because the duke had fallen to a freak of fortune. 2 pillars cracking in a single week, and not to any flaw in the design. The book did for Cesare Borgia what no victory could have done. It turned him from a man into a case study, the permanent example in the permanent textbook of power, read by every generation since. From the councils of kings to the syllabus of every modern war, college and business school, the man lost everything at 31. The method has never been out of print. The second door opened in Spain 2 generations later, and it is the strangest fact in the entire Borgia file. The dukedom of Gandia, Juan's dukedom, the empty chair that started so much of this, passed down through Juan's line, and in 1510 his grandson was born, a great-grandson of Pope Alexander VI. Francis Borgia grew up a grandee of Spain, courtier to the emperor, viceroy of Catalonia, husband, father of 8, then, in his late 30s, widowed and changed. He gave all of it away, the titles, the estates, the court, and entered the newly founded Society of Jesus as a priest. He rose to lead the Jesuits worldwide as their 3rd superior general, directed the order's missions into Asia and the Americas, and lived with an austerity that became proverbial. In 1670, the Church, his great-grandfather, had scandalized, declared him a saint, Saint Francis Borgia, the bloodline that Europe had learned to pronounce like the name of a poison ends. In the official rolls of the Catholic Church, on an altar, his name stands today in carved stone over parish doors and school entrances across the United States. In Missouri, in Wisconsin, in towns that did not exist when the Tiber was taking this family's secrets, which leaves the rooms. After the summer of 1503, the painted apartments stopped being the Pope's home. Julius II refused to sleep beneath the golden bulls of the man he had hated, refused even to use the chambers where his enemy had died, and moved the papal residence upstairs, where he commissioned a young painter named Raphael to decorate the walls of his new rooms instead. Downstairs, the Borgia apartments began their long second life. Over the following centuries, they were handed to cardinals and officials, filled with collections, converted into a picture gallery under one pope and a library under another. Their original purpose fading a little with each new occupant until almost nobody remembered what the bulls on the ceiling had been for. At the end of the 19th century, Leo XIII had the frescoes restored and opened the rooms to the public. They have been open ever since. Every morning now, visitors from every country on earth file through those 6 chambers on the way to the Sistine Chapel, and they stop and look up and find Saint Catherine with the face they have read about, and the kneeling Pope in his cope of gold, and the bulls, everywhere the bulls, grazing among the saints, exactly where the family put them. The Borgias lost every war they fought for land. The duchies reverted. The fortresses fell, and the direct line dissolved into other houses and other names. What they won, without ever aiming at it, was the one territory no army of their century could reach. They wanted an empire, and empires they got a legend instead, and nobody has ever managed to kill it.